In the cracked heart of Dry Creek Junction, sun-baked patch of nowhere where secrets festered like old wounds and debts, piled up faster than rain in a drought, Wyatt Coulter sat astride a battered old gelding that looked every bit as tired as he felt. His hat was pulled low to shield his eyes from the cruel Nevada sun, but it couldn't hide the tight lines etched into his face or the bruises beneath his left eye, fading now to a sickly yellow-green. People said Wyatt was a fool to stay in. Dry Creek said he should have sold his daddy's ranch the day his father died and the bank came knocking. But a man's land was more than acres of scrub and fence posts. It was the only thing he had left of a father whose love was hard-earned and rarely spoken. Wyatt would be damned before he let it slip through his fingers like the water that barely trickled down the irrigation ditches his father built with hands calloused by decades of toil. Today was auction day. Not cattle, not land, no. Today was something darker. Sheriff Cole called it a charity auction, but the entire town knew the truth. Desperate folks, debts unpaid, mouths too many to feed. Men who'd bet their last dollar at the saloon or drank it away now offered up what little they had left. And sometimes that meant people. The crowd gathered on the dusty street outside Dry Creek's lone hotel. The sign swung crooked above. The door, letters so faded you could barely read Hope's End. Maybe that was fitting. The air tasted like sweat and old whiskey. Folks murmured to one another, eyes downcast, shame burning behind polite nods and forced smiles. Wyatt dismounted, boots raising little puffs of dust that clung to his worn trousers. He pushed through. The crowd, every step dragging a boulder of guilt behind it. Sheriff Cole stood on the rickety porch, wide belly straining his tarnished badge. He wore the grin of a man who liked his job a little too much, who liked watching good folks break under the weight of bad luck. "All right now," Cole barked. "Next up, we got a special lot." A hush fell as two deputies led a woman up the steps. She was slight, her dress patched at the elbows, hair pinned back in a style that spoke of once better days. But it wasn't the poverty that drew the gasps. It was the strip of faded cloth tied around her eyes. "This here's Miss Lenora Whitcomb," Cole announced. "And her two boys." Lenora held their hands, two scrawny twin boys no older than 6, both clinging to her like barnacles to a hull. Their clothes were threadbare, feet bare, eyes wide with the kind of fear a child should never know. Wyatt's mouth went dry. He'd heard the rumors. Lenora Whitcomb, the preacher's daughter who'd married a traveling merchant gone blind in a fever, widowed not a year after. Folks said she kept her boys fed by sewing when she could and going hungry when she couldn't. But debts found everyone in Dry Creek, sooner or later. Cole cleared his throat. "Now Miss Lenora here owes the bank $70 in back rent. Pastor can't keep her at the church no more. So law says she needs a man to provide. Auction's legal, folks, is the way of things." Lenora's chin lifted. She didn't face the crowd but the wind, as if listening for a mercy that never came. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady soft, but strong enough to carry. "I'll work hard. I know how to cook, sew, tend a house. My boys, they're good boys." Wyatt's stomach twisted. He knew half the men in this crowd would take her home for the wrong reasons. He knew how a blind woman could be used and tossed aside. His gaze swept the faces, ranchers with yellow teeth and leering smiles, drifters with coins jingling in their pockets and cruelty behind their eyes. He didn't have $70. Hell, he barely had 7. But as Lenora's lips moved in, a silent prayer, something in Wyatt, something battered and near broken, stirred like a colt in a storm. Sheriff Cole's hammer struck the post. "We'll start the bidding at $30. Silence, then a voice. 30. Old man Kincaid, whose wife died last winter, eyes crawling over Lenora like a butcher appraising meat. Another voice. 35. Snickers. 40. Wyatt heard. His heart beat louder than the numbers. His fingers dug into the reins he still held, leather cutting into calloused skin. He felt his father's voice in his bones. A man stands where others won't. That's the measure of him. 50, Kincaid rasped. Ain't blind in the kitchen, is she? Laughter rippled, cold and sharp. Lenora's hands tightened on her boys. One of them whimpered, but she shushed him, a mother's instinct unbroken by desperation. Wyatt stepped forward before his fear could drag him back. 65. Heads turned. He felt the weight of their disbelief press on his shoulders like a yoke. Cole squinted at him, that oily grin stretching wider. 65, you got that kind of coin, Coulter? Thought the bank's got you by the short hairs. I got it, Wyatt lied. Or I will, Kincaid sneered. 70. Wyatt's breath caught. 70. He thought of the land. The barn with the roof that leaked when it rained. The cows that ate more. Then they gave. $70 could feed him and his debts for a season, maybe two. But he looked at Lenora, at her boys. At the way her blind eyes seemed to look straight through him, like she could see the man he'd been trying so hard not to become. 80. The word ripped out of him like a bullet. $80. The crowd sucked in a collective breath. Sheriff Cole's eyes gleamed. Going once, twice. No one else spoke. Even Kincaid stepped back, muttering under his breath. The sheriff slammed the hammer down. Sold to the poor fool who don't know when to fold. Wyatt's legs felt boneless. He moved up the steps, every footfall an echo of the future he'd just gambled away. He took Lenora's trembling hand, rough and thin, but warm. Miss Whitcomb, he said, voice low, I'm Wyatt Coulter, you and your boys. You'll come home with me now. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She only nodded once, chin high. We'll work hard, Mr. Coulter. He glanced at her twins. One boy hid behind her skirts, the other stared at him with defiant, suspicious eyes. I know you will, Wyatt said, though he didn't know anything anymore, except that the sun was still hot and the wind was still dry, and that somewhere deep inside him, something heavy had shifted. They made their way down the steps, the crowd, parting like a wound that would never close. Whispers followed them. Poor fool. Blind as she is. Debt on top of debt. But none of that mattered now. Wyatt felt Lenora's hand in his, her boy's tiny fingers gripping his coat, and for the first time in a long while, the weight of his father's voice lifted just enough for Wyatt to breathe. He had no plan for how he'd pay. No plan for what he'd tell the bank when they came for their due. But when Lenora turned her blind face toward him, lips parting like she wanted to say something but thought better of it, he realized maybe he didn't need a plan. Maybe, just maybe, all a man needed was to stand where others wouldn't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The wind whipped down from the hills as Wyatt led Lenora and her boys through the main street of Dry Creek Junction. Folks parted around them, some tipping their hats in mock respect, some sneering behind cupped hands. Every word felt like grit. Under Wyatt's boots. Blind bride. One man muttered to another, loud enough for Wyatt to hear. He's digging his grave with that one. Wyatt kept his head down, one hand steady on the horse's reins, the other guiding Lenora. Her fingers clung to his forearm, cold but certain, her blindfold fluttering with each gust of wind. The boys trailed close, small feet stirring up the queue. Dusk dot, it felt like the whole town was watching, measuring him like cattle at auction. He wondered how many would still whisper when the bank came to take what little he had left. But Lenora didn't flinch, even when stones skittered near her feet. Her jaw set firm, as if she'd learned long ago how to swallow shame and make it taste like resolve. They reached Wyatt's horse. He helped her up, his calloused hands brushing her waist as he lifted her onto the worn saddle. The boys clambered up behind her, thin arms wrapped around her sides. Hold tight, he murmured. She didn't smile. She just tilted her head to where his voice came from. I trust you. Those 3 words stuck with him all the way out of town. Past the dry creek that gave the place its name. Past the old burnt-out mill and the brittle fences that marked the boundary of his father's land. Trust, like it was something he could still be worth. By the time the Coulter homestead came into view, dusk was gathering at the edges of the plains. The house squatted low against the horizon, weathered boards patched with whatever Wyatt could afford, tin sheets, tar paper, old cloth nailed over cracked windows. The barn leaned to one side like an old drunk who'd forgotten how to stand straight. Lenora sat astride the horse, quiet, her chin lifted toward the dying light. Her boys shifted restlessly, too hungry and too tired to pretend at bravery. Wyatt tied off the reins and helped them down. The moment Lenora's boots touched the dirt, she stumbled. He caught her elbow. She didn't pull away. Where's the door? She asked softly. He guided her to the porch 3 steps up, one squealing like a pig underfoot. Mind the second step. Been meaning to fix it. He tried to say it like it was normal. Like he was welcoming her to something that wasn't broken. And near empty. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and the faint bitterness of the morning's coffee still lingering in the pot. The front room was sparse, one sagging armchair, a wood stove that needed chopping before it would keep anyone warm tonight, and a battered table with 3 chairs that didn't match. He hadn't had reason to fix any of it. Until now, the twins hovered near the door, wide-eyed. Lenora reached for them. Go on, boys, find a corner to sit. We'll figure things out soon. Wyatt set about the only thing he knew how to do, making work happen. He cleared the table, swept the dust from the hearth, stoked the fire until it glowed soft and orange. He found half a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese. It wasn't much. It was what he had when he set the plates down. Lenora tilted her face toward him. You didn't have to bid on us. Her voice was quiet, but the edge was there, steel wrapped in velvet. Wyatt leaned against the table, picking at a splinter in the wood. Didn't sit right. Seeing you up there like that. Does it sit right? Now? She gestured vaguely at the bare room, her eyes blank under the cloth. You bought more debt when you already had plenty. Don't much care how it sits, he said. It's done, you and the boys, you're here now. One of the twins, he thought his name was Caleb, nibbled at the bread like a scared rabbit. The other, Micah maybe, stared at Wyatt like he was a wolf at the door. Lenora's hand found the boy's shoulder, her fingers gentle. They've been through worse than this house can throw at them, she said. We'll work, Mr. Coulter. I can sew, I can mend. And the boys are stronger than they look. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. It's Wyatt, and you don't owe me any more work than you can give. I don't plan to be dead weight. She said it like a promise. He believed her. They ate in silence, the only sound the wind scratching at the shutters. Afterward, Wyatt showed them the small room off the kitchen, his father's old room, the one he hadn't stepped into since the funeral. He'd been sleeping on a cot by the stove ever since. He lit the oil lamp and watched. Lenora's fingers traced the edge of the quilt on the bed. She didn't ask what happened to the man who used to sleep there. Maybe she already knew. Maybe. She could hear the ghosts in the floorboards, same as him. It's warm, she said. It'll do. She turned her blind eyes to him, as if she could see the shape of him in the dark. For the first time her voice trembled. Thank you. He swallowed. You should get some rest. I'll be in the front room if you need anything. He left the door open a crack, listening as she settled the boys onto the bed, their whispers soft as moth wings. Then silence. Wyatt sank into the armchair by the stove, staring into the coals until they blurred. He thought about what the bank would say when they found out. About the way Sheriff Cole's eyes had glinted when he slammed down that gavel. About how easy it would be for this to turn into another bad debt on top of the rest. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Lenora standing. There on that rickety porch, blind but unbowed, holding her boys like they were worth the world. He'd spent his whole life letting this land chain him to the dirt. Maybe now it was time to see if something good could grow from it instead. Sleep came slow, fitful. He dreamed of rain falling on dry ground, of hands, small and soft, tugging at his coat, of a voice in the dark saying, "I trust you." When dawn broke, Wyatt rose and set the kettle on the stove. He heard the creak of the bedroom door, Lenora's soft steps in the hall. "We'll find a way," she said, as if she'd read his mind. He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, we will." The sun pushed through the dusty windows, pale and fragile, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough. By mid-morning, Wyatt was knee-deep in the corral, boots squelching in the mud that the cattle had churned up overnight. He hadn't had time to mend the fencing yet, so 2 steers had broken through, wandering dangerously close to the creek. "Bed." He guided them back with quiet curses under his breath, the sting of the auction still hot in his mind. Behind him, he heard the door of the house creak open. Lenora's footsteps, he'd learned the sound already, were soft but purposeful. She paused on the porch, the hem of her dress brushing against the splintered wood. One hand rested lightly on the railing, the other hovered near her waist, fingers twitching like she was measuring the world in shapes and spaces she could only feel. "Wyatt?" Her voice floated across the yard, fragile yet firm. He wiped his brow with his sleeve. "Over here." She tilted her head toward his voice, her blindfold a pale slash across her sunburnt face. "I didn't hear you come back in for breakfast." "Wasn't hungry," he lied. "Cattle got out again. Fence needs patching." She stepped off the porch carefully, foot seeking the earth like a child testing ice. The twins clung to the doorway, peering around her skirt. Caleb, he was sure now of the name, held a battered tin cup in his hands, and Micah clutched the hem of his mother's dress like it was the last safe thing in the world. Lenora stopped a few feet from the corral fence. "I can help." Wyatt laughed before he could stop himself, sharp, raw. "How you gonna fix a fence you can't see?" The words stunned the air between them. Her head lifted, lips pressed thin. "I can mend clothes, can't I? Stitch leather, fix torn shirts, darn socks. A fence is just bigger stitches." He opened his mouth to argue, then shut it. She had a way of cutting through excuses before they were half-shaped. She stepped closer, her skirts brushing the rough wood of the fence. "If you tell me what to hold, where to nail, I can do it. I can feel it." Wyatt glanced at her boys. "There." Eyes darted between him and their mother, wide and watchful. He remembered his own father, how he'd barked orders that felt like bullets ricocheting in the barn. How his mother had stood at the window, hands wringing a dish towel until it was afraid not. He didn't want to be that kind of man. "Not now, all right," he said. "But mind the nails, they're rusted." A ghost of a smile tugged at her mouth. "Rust can't hurt me more than being idle." He passed her the hammer, guided her fingers to the cracked boards. She worked by touch, every movement deliberate. He showed her where the break ran, how to hold the wood steady while he pounded the nails home. The boys perched on a fence rail nearby, whispering to each other, still wary but no longer afraid. An hour passed, then 2. The sun rose higher, burning the chill from the air. Sweat trickled down Wyatt's spine as he watched her work, her hands steady despite the rough splinters biting into her palms. Once, he reached out to brush a stray hair from her forehead. His fingers lingered longer than they should have, the warmth of her skin startling him. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just kept hammering when the fence wasn't done good. Enough to keep the steers from wandering again. Wyatt leaned his arms on the top rail and looked at her, really looked. The shadows under her blindfold, the sunburn creeping along her throat, the rawness of her hands. "Thank you," he said, the words scraping out like they'd been stuck behind his teeth for years. She set the hammer down carefully. "Don't Thank me yet, there's still the roof. He barked a laugh, quick and sharp. You planning to climb up there too? If you hold the ladder, she said, I'll hold the nails. He shook his head, half smiling despite himself. The wind carried the smell of sage and distant rain. For a heartbeat, he imagined what it might be like to wake up each day, knowing someone was standing beside him, not out of obligation or pity, but because they chose to stay. Come on, he said. Let's get you and the boys inside. You're gonna tear those hands up worse than any fence could. She let him guide her back to the porch. The twins skipped ahead, racing each other up the steps. Caleb whooped when he won, a sound that sliced through the tight knot in Wyatt's chest. Inside, he poured her water from the chipped jug. She drank slowly, tilting her face to the sun streaming through the crooked window. Her throat worked as she swallowed, and for the first time he saw how thin she really was, the way her collarbone cut shadows against her skin. I'll put the boys to work too, she said when she set the cup down. They can gather eggs, sweep, feed the chickens. They're just kids, Wyatt protested. They're my kids, she countered, her voice gentle but edged with iron. They need to know this place is theirs too. The word theirs stuck in his mind long after she'd moved on to wiping down the table. He caught the boys watching him, one pair of eyes defiant, the other curious. He forced a smile he didn't quite feel. You boys ever milk a cow? Caleb shrugged. Ma let us feed goats once. Not the same, Wyatt said, but close enough. He led them out back to the lean-to, showed them how to brace the pail, how to calm old Bessie with soft words. The first tug got them a kick of mud on their boots, which sent Micah into fits of laughter. For the first time, Wyatt laughed to a sound so foreign it made his ribs ache. When the morning stretched toward noon, he caught Lenora standing at the back door, listening. A breeze lifted her hair, stirring it like a dark banner behind her shoulders. She looked strong, unbreakable somehow. Even with the ragged cloth over her eyes, she must have felt him watching, because she turned her face toward him. How's it going? Better than I thought, he called back. They've made more mess than milk, but we'll get there. She laughed low, warm, unguarded. The sound dug into him deeper than any dead ever could dot inside. The smell of stew started to drift out the door. He wondered what she'd found to put in it. Probably stretched scraps of salted meat and the last carrots from the root cellar. He felt the guilt creep in again, the weight of all he couldn't give. But when he looked back at her, her hands busy at the stove, the boys scrubbing their mud-caked boots at the well, he realized there was more here now than there'd been just yesterday. More laughter, more noise, more life. When they sat to eat, she said grace, her voice calm and clear, the boys bowing their heads like it was the only solid thing they had to hold on to. Wyatt didn't bow his head. He watched her instead and wondered how a blind woman could see more of him than he'd ever dared show the world. Maybe. He thought it wasn't about what he could give. Maybe it was about what they could build, stitch by stitch, one broken fence and battered roof at a time. He scooped another spoonful of stew and let the warmth settle in his chest, daring for the first time in years to hope. Afternoon heat pressed down on the Coulter place like a hand on a wound, but inside the house there was a hum of life that hadn't been there in years. Wyatt stood on the porch, a hammer in his fist, staring at the bent nail he'd been meaning to fix since last winter. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck, mixing with the dust that clung to his shirt. Behind him, laughter spilled through the open door. Lenora's voice carried over the boys' chatter, a gentle reminder to hush while they worked. Wyatt couldn't remember the last time he'd heard laughter in this house. Not like that. He pried the nail loose, driven by a restless energy that had chased him since dawn. He'd patched the barn roof at sunrise, worked the cattle through the east pasture by noon, and still his hands itched for more. Anything to keep from thinking about the banknote folded up in his pocket, The one he'd promised to settle and now had no earthly way to pay. The screen door creaked behind him. Lenora stepped onto the porch, her bare feet cautious against the warped boards. She didn't need her eyes to find him. She tilted her face toward the soft clink of his hammer. "You're working too hard," she said, her voice soft but edged with the same iron he'd come to expect. He didn't turn. Just spat the bent nail into the dirt. Better than sitting around, waiting for the roof to cave in. She moved closer, her hand brushing the porch railing. "You think if you fix every broken thing, the worry will go away?" He let out a humorless laugh. Better than praying it away. Her fingers found the post near his arm, tracing the grooves in the wood. "I pray," she said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "But my hands stay busy too." He glanced at her, the wind tugging loose strands of hair across her blindfold. "How's mending a torn shirt gonna stop the bank from knocking on my door?" She didn't answer right away. Just leaned her hip against the rail, listening to the distant low of cattle, the soft giggle of the boys as they chased each other through the yard. "It won't," she said finally. "But it makes this house feel like a home. And maybe a home's what you need when that knock comes." He set the hammer down, the handle thunking against the porch boards. "I didn't buy you to fix my life, Lenora." Her head snapped up fast, fierce. "You didn't buy me at all. You paid a debt no one else would touch. I know the difference." They stood there, the dry wind stealing the sweat from his skin. He looked at her, really looked. The sun catching the curve of her cheek, the scar near her temple he hadn't noticed that first day. She looked breakable. But he knew better now. She stepped closer, so close he could smell soap and wood smoke in her hair. "You've been alone." "Too long," she said. "So have I. Maybe the way through is together." He wanted to tell her how wrong she was. How the weight of the land, the bank, his father's ghost, none of it could be lifted by a woman and two boys who had less than he did. But the words caught in his throat. Inside the house, a chair scraped across the floor. One of the boys shouted, "Ma!" Lenora's mouth curved in a half-smile. "Duty calls," she said, her hand brushing his arm before she turned. He watched her go, the sway of her skirt, the steady, confident way she moved through a world she could not see. And for a moment, the itch under his skin eased. That night, Wyatt lay awake on his cot by the stove. He could hear the rise and fall of Lenora's breathing through the thin wall, the soft sighs of the boys tangled up in quilts. He stared at the ceiling beams, tracing old leaks and cracks he knew by heart. A coyote howled in the hills. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The bank, the debts. Sheriff Cole's smirk as he slammed the gavel down. Every worry stacked like rotten lumber in his mind. A floorboard creaked. Soft steps. He opened his eyes to see Lenora standing in the doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Couldn't shut my head off." He swung his legs off the cot, boots scraping the floor. She crossed the room, found his hand, settled beside him on the edge of the narrow bed. "Tell me what's keeping you up." He laughed, but it sounded bitter in the dark. "How much time you got?" "All night if you need it." The fire in the stove threw shadows across her face. He looked at her, at the way she leaned in, patient as stone. "It's all slipping through my fingers, the ranch, the land. I got 2 good seasons left, maybe. And now I've dragged you and the boys into it." Her fingers found his. Rough calluses met the soft ridges of her palms. "Maybe you didn't drag us. Maybe we walked in with our heads high." He wanted to argue, but her hands were warm, steady. "What happens when the bank comes?" he asked. "When they tell us we got to go." "Then we go," she said. "But we'll go together, not alone." He stared at the floor. "That easy, huh?" "No," she said, voice breaking the dark like a promise. "It's never easy, but it's enough." She let go of his hand, stood, the blanket trailing behind her. Get some sleep, Wyatt Coulter. Tomorrow's waiting. He watched her disappear down the hall. For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest shift. Not gone, but lighter somehow. Morning came sharp and cold. The boys were already up, chasing chickens across the yard, their laughter echoing off the empty barn. Lenora stood by the porch, basket hooked over her arm, head turned toward the sunrise. Wyatt stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What's this? She smiled. I'm going into town. His gut clenched. Town? Alone? Not alone. She gestured to the boys. We'll walk, take the eggs, see if we can sell them. He frowned. The road's rough. And Cole. She shook her head, her blindfold catching the breeze. Let them talk. We're not charity. He stepped forward, boots crunching on the frost-bitten grass. You don't owe me that. It's not about you, she said, her voice soft but cutting like a whetstone. It's about us, she whistled for the boys. They scampered to her side, grubby hands clutching the basket like a prize. Wyatt watched them start down the path, their shadows long in the morning light. He wanted to call after them, to tell her, to wait, to stay safe, to stay home. But the words died on his tongue. Instead, he picked up the hammer he'd left on the porch and got to work. Wyatt worked through the morning with the rhythm of a man trying to outrun the thoughts in his head. He hauled wood from the old shed, split logs until his shoulders burned, patched a corner of the chicken coop the foxes had been worrying at. For weeks. But every swing of the axe, every hammer strike, carried the same ghost. Lenora and the boys on that long road to town, their shadows swallowed up by the pale light of dawn. He didn't trust Dry Creek. He'd grown up watching how it ground down the unlucky. He'd seen what men did when they thought no one was looking, what they'd do for a handful of coins or just because they could. Lenora wasn't weak, but she was still blind. And the boys' God, the thought of their small hands holding that egg basket like a shield made him want to run after them, drag them back, lock the door against the whole damn town. But he didn't. Instead, he buried his worry in the familiar ache of work. When the sun rose overhead, he went inside, washed the dirt from his hands at the cracked basin. He caught his reflection in the speckled glass, a man who looked too old for 26, eyes ringed in shadows that no sleep could fix. A soft knock rattled the door. Wyatt turned, heart stuttering like a colt caught in barbed wire. It was too soon for them to be back. He wiped his hands on his trousers, crossed the room in 3 strides. He flung the door open and froze. It wasn't Lenora. Sheriff Cole leaned against the porch post, a smirk playing on his thin lips. He tipped his hat with mock politeness. Morning, Coulter. Wyatt's jaw tensed. Sheriff. Cole stepped inside without waiting to be invited, spurs tapping across the worn floorboards. He took in the battered furniture, the threadbare curtains Lenora had hung up just days ago. Looks better than I expected, he drawled. Your new bride got you playing house? Wyatt bit down on the words that wanted to spill out. What do you want, Cole? The sheriff wandered to the stove, lifted the kettle, sniffed like he was expecting. Poison, Bank's been talking. Word is you're overdue by 3 months now. Might be more, if I'm counting right. I know what I owe. Cole grinned, showing yellow. Wyatt worked through the morning with the rhythm of a man trying to outrun the thoughts in his head. He hauled wood from the old shed, split logs until his shoulders burned, patched a corner of the chicken coop the foxes had been worrying at. For weeks. But every swing of the axe, every hammer strike, carried the same ghost. Lenora and the boys on that long road to town, their shadows swallowed up by the pale light of dawn. He didn't trust Dry Creek. He'd grown up watching how it ground down the unlucky. He'd seen what men did when they thought no one was looking, what they'd do for a handful of coins or just because they could. Lenora wasn't weak, but she was still blind. And the boy's God, The thought of their small hands holding that egg basket like a shield made him want to run after them, drag them back, lock the door against the whole damn town. But he didn't. Instead, he buried his worry in the familiar ache of work. When the sun rose overhead, he went inside, washed the dirt from his hands at the cracked basin. He caught his reflection in the speckled glass. A man who looked too old for 26, eyes ringed in shadows that no sleep could fix. A soft knock rattled the door. Wyatt turned, heart stuttering like a colt caught in barbed wire. It was too soon for them to be back. He wiped his hands on his trousers, crossed the room in 3 strides. He flung the door open and froze. It wasn't Lenora. Sheriff Cole leaned against the porch post, a smirk playing on his thin lips. He tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Morning, Coulter." Wyatt's jaw tensed. "Sheriff." Cole stepped inside without waiting to be invited, spurs tapping across the worn floorboards. He took in the battered furniture, the threadbare curtains Lenora had hung up just days ago. "Looks better than I expected," he drawled. "Your new bride got you playing house?" Wyatt bit down on the words that wanted to spill out. "What do you want, Cole?" The sheriff wandered to the stove, lifted the kettle, sniffed like he was expecting. "Poison. Bank's been talking. Word is you're overdue by 3 months now. Might be more, if I'm counting right. I know what I owe." Cole grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Oh, I bet you do. Trouble is, the bank ain't as patient as your new missus. They'll come for that land, Coulter, sooner or later." Wyatt crossed his arms over his chest, then let him come. Cole turned, voice dropping low, slick as oil. "You think they'll let you keep her? The boys? Men like you, they'll say you can't provide. Might say she'd be better off elsewhere." Wyatt's stomach twisted. He took a step closer, fists clenching. "You come here to threaten me, or you got something else to say?" Cole's grin widened. "Just being neighborly. Thought you might like to know how folks in town talk when you're not there to hear. A man like you, with a blind wife, folks wonder what you're hiding." Wyatt felt the heat climb up his neck. "Get off my land." Cole tipped his hat again, eyes glittering. "As you like. But if I were you, I'd watch that pretty bride of yours. Lot of rough men drift through Dry Creek. Some ain't so polite about what they take." He was gone before Wyatt could move, boots crunching down the porch steps. The front gate slammed shut behind him, the echo snapping something loose in Wyatt's chest. He stood there long after the sheriff's horse had kicked up dust on the road. He felt the weight of Cole's words settle like stones in his gut. Lenora had walked into town to help him, to save what little they had left, and he just stood there, letting his worst fear walk right up to the door. Wyatt grabbed his coat from the peg, nearly tearing it from the wall. He saddled his horse in record time, ignoring the throb in his back, the rawness in his palms. He didn't care how it looked, a man riding into town after his wife like some fool who couldn't hold his own house together. The road to Dry Creek was bone dry, dust rising in sheets behind the geldings' hooves. Every mile he replayed the look on Lenora's face that morning, head high, basket on her arm. Boys flanking her like twin shadows. Brave. Too damn brave for a town that'd eat them alive if it got the chance. By the time he crested the ridge, the sun was high enough to set the clapboard roofs of Dry Creek, glowing like white-hot iron. He spotted them near the general store, Lenora's slender frame, the boys at her sides, the egg basket empty now. They stood near the porch while a cluster of townsfolk loitered nearby. Old Kincaid with his bitter mouth, a pair of ranch hands Wyatt didn't recognize, and the banker's son, Everett Dooling, who had his arms crossed, eyes locked on Lenora. Like a vulture eyeing fresh kill, Wyatt swung off his horse so fast his boots hit the dirt in a cloud. He stalked across the street, every step drawing eyes. He heard his name on people's lips: Coulter, fool, broke rancher, and he shoved it aside like barbed wire. Lenora turned as he neared, her face lifting toward the weight of his steps. She didn't flinch. "Wyatt?" He stopped beside her, hand brushing her elbow. The boys pressed closer, their small hands wrapping around his coat. He shot Everett a look that could have carved stone. Everett just sneered. Wyatt kept his arms wrapped around Lenora as the old gelding plodded down the dusty road away from Dry Creek. The boys sat pressed against her sides, their soft chatter a lullaby that settled some small part of the storm still roiling in his chest. But the sheriff's words, Everett Dooling's sneer, the way folks had looked at her, at them, stuck to him like burrs in his shirt. By the time the ranch gate came into view, the sun was low, painting the dry hills in gold and copper. Lenora tilted her face toward the warmth, a soft smile playing on her lips. She couldn't see it, but somehow Wyatt suspected she felt the same thing he did, that this battered land, for all its meanness, was theirs to hold or lose together. When they dismounted, the boys scrambled off first, boots thudding against the packed dirt. Lenora shifted, her hand brushing Wyatt's arm for balance. He steadied her, his fingers lingering at her elbow longer than they needed to. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. That trust God, it was heavier than any debt note in his pocket. Inside, the house smelled of dried sage and the faint sweetness of the penny candy she'd bartered for in town. Caleb and Micah ripped the paper wrappers open like it was Christmas come early, whooping and laughing until they collapsed in the corner to count out what little sugar they'd claimed for themselves. Lenora busied herself by the stove, fingers moving deftly over the flour sack, measuring by feel. Wyatt watched her, arms crossed over his chest, boots planted on the creaking floorboards. He'd never seen anyone turn so little into so much. She could have been queen of a kingdom, and he doubted she'd move any different. "You didn't have to come after us," she said, breaking the silence without turning. He frowned. "Didn't sit right, you out there alone." "I wasn't alone." She dusted her palms clean, then turned toward him, blindfolded eyes somehow pinning him to the spot. "You don't have to protect us from the world, Wyatt. Just stand with us when it comes." He scrubbed a hand through his hair. "Same thing far as I'm concerned." A ghost of a smile curved her mouth. "Not quite." They ate what they had, stew bulked out with wild onions she'd coaxed the boys into pulling from the far edge of the pasture. Afterward, they all sat near the hearth, the boys half asleep against her sides. Wyatt listened to the crackle of the fire, the creak of the old wood beneath them, the soft sound of Lenora humming a tune she must have carried from girlhood. The weight of the day fell from his shoulders, slow and reluctant but real. When the boys finally nodded off, Wyatt gathered them up one by one and carried them to the old bedroom. He caught Lenora leaning against the doorway, her hands resting on the frame, listening to the sound of her son's soft breathing. He wondered if she still saw them in dreams clear as the day they were born, before the sickness took her sight. Back in the main room, she waited by the table, fingertips brushing the edge like she was grounding herself. "You think you're failing them," she said, voice low. "But you're not. You're showing them how a man stands when the wind comes hard." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to let that truth sink into the cracks that worry had carved out of him. But he could still feel the paper folded in his pocket. The debt, the future pressing down like thunderclouds ready to break. "You should sleep," he said instead. "Tomorrow's another full day," she hesitated. "And you?" He forced a small grin. "Sleep's for men who don't owe half the county their souls." Lenora stepped closer. Her hand reached out, found his chest, rested there light, but sure, then sleep beside the fire. "Dream of something better. I'll hold the rest for you, till you're ready to carry it again." He didn't know how to answer that. Didn't trust his voice to hold steady. So he just nodded once, and when her hand fell away, the warmth lingered like a promise. Wyatt rose before dawn. He found her curled up on the old sofa, one arm draped over Micah, the other cradling Caleb against her chest. The boy's hair was a tangle of curls, their faces peaceful for the first time since that hellish auction day. He slipped out to the barn. The wind cut cold through his shirt, but the physical work was a relief, mending the splintered gate. Hauling bales too heavy for one man to lift, but impossible to leave undone. He worked until his shoulders burned and his breath fogged in the gray light. By the time he trudged back to the house, the sun was creeping over the hills. Inside, Lenora was already up, humming to herself as she kneaded dough at the table. She tilted her face toward him when he stepped in, her blindfold loose around her hair like a faded crown. "You didn't have to do all that alone," she said. "Couldn't." "Sleep." He tried for a grin, but it fell flat. "So you punish your back instead?" Her voice was soft, but the steel was there. He chuckled, sat opposite her. "Keeps the worry quiet." She pressed her thumb into the dough, shaping it with sure hands. "Worry never stays quiet, Wyatt Coulter. Not unless you share it." He studied her hands, pale and strong. "How'd you learn to be so steady?" She paused. "I went blind when the boys were babies. One morning I woke up, and the world was gone. All I had left was touch, and their breathing. You'd be steady too, if you had to hold the world that way." Wyatt swallowed hard, fighting the lump that threatened to choke him. "I want to give you more than this." "You have," she said. "You gave us a roof, a chance to stand. That's more than any man's ever given me." Before he could answer, the front door banged open. Caleb burst through, mud caked on his trousers, eyes wide with excitement. "Pa, Ma, there's a stranger out by the fence. Says he's looking for you." Wyatt was on his feet before the boy finished. He grabbed his coat, felt the heavy iron of the old revolver hidden in the pocket. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." Lenora didn't protest. She just stood, one hand on Caleb's shoulder, the other drifting down to find Micah as he peeked out from behind her skirt. Outside, the cold wind slapped him awake. A figure waited near the gate, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long duster that flapped around his boots. A hat shaded most of his face, but when he looked up, the grin was unmistakable. Jeb Rollins. Wyatt's gut twisted. He hadn't seen Jeb since the cattle drive 3 years ago, back when they'd both believed fortune was waiting over the next hill, back when Wyatt still thought the land would save him. "Wyatt Coulter," Jeb called, voice smooth as snake oil. "Heard you bought yourself a wife. Heard she's blind as a mule, but twice as stubborn." Wyatt's jaw clenched. "Don't you talk about her." Jeb raised his hands, grin widening. "Easy now. I'm here with an offer." "What kind of offer?" Jeb leaned against the fence post, boots scraping the dirt. "Word is you're drowning. Land's too dry, cattle too thin. But I know a buyer looking to snap up your acres. Pay off your debts, give you enough to ride south and start clean." Wyatt shook his head. "Not selling. Think about your pretty bride, your boys. You really want them stuck here when the bank comes with chains and a lawman's gun?" Wyatt stepped forward, boots crunching frost. "I said, or maybe you think she'd thank you," Jeb cut in. "Thank you for letting her stand on an auction block all over again when the bank takes this place." Rage roared up his spine. In one motion, Wyatt grabbed the fence rail, hauling himself over. Jeb didn't flinch, just watched him with that same oily smile. "Don't you talk about her," Wyatt snarled, voice raw. "You want to sell something, go peddle your lies in town." Jeb straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Last chance, Coulter. Take the offer, or you'll wish you had." Wyatt stood his ground as Jeb swung up on his horse and turned down the road. The threat hung in the air long after the dust settled. When he walked back toward the house, he saw Lenora at the window, her blindfolded face pressed to the glass. He knew she couldn't see him, but somehow he felt her gaze just the same. He lifted a hand. She didn't wave back, but she didn't turn away either. Inside that house, Wyatt thought, was the only thing in this world worth fighting for. And he'd fight. By God, come wind or drought or men like Jeb Rollins, he'd stand where others broke. Wyatt stepped into the house and shut the door behind him like he was holding the wind outside by sheer force of will. Lenora stood by the table, hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug. The boys peeked out from behind her skirts, their eyes darting to Wyatt's face, then the door, then back again. He could feel the question waiting on her lips. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to tell the truth either. So he shrugged off his coat, hung it on the peg by the door, and forced himself to cross the room like his boots weren't filled with mud and dread. "Who was it?" she asked. Quiet but steady. An old hand from the drive, Jeb Rollins. She didn't flinch. What did he want? Wyatt poured himself the dregs of the morning's coffee. It tasted like burnt dirt, but it gave him a moment to think. Said he knew a buyer. Talked like he could fix everything if I just handed over the deed. Lenora tilted her head, listening not to his words, but to the knots in his voice. "You told him no?" He met her blank eyes, wished she could see the promise in his face. "I told him he'd have to ride through me first." A ghost of a smile curved her lips. "Good." The boys eased out from behind her skirts, sensing the tension bleed off like rain down a window. Caleb crossed the floor to tug at Wyatt's sleeve. "Huh." The word still hit him like a blow every time, unexpected, sharp, stitched through with something that both hurt and healed. "Yeah, boy. Can we help today?" "Ma said we could carry kindling." Wyatt ruffled the boy's hair. "You can help me feed the herd. Bring that bucket by the fence, all right?" Caleb scampered off, Micah hot on his heels, their boots clomping across the porch like colts too young to mind their weight. Lenora turned her face back toward him. "Don't let Rollins in your head, Wyatt. That man's poison." He drained the coffee and set the mug down harder than he meant to. "I can handle Jeb. It's the bank I'm worried about." "Then we handle them too," she said. Simple as a prayer. He watched her find the dishcloth, her fingers moving over the edge of the table to guide herself. So sure, even when the world stayed black behind her eyes. He envied it, the steel in her spine, the calm in her words. Outside, the boys' laughter drifted in. Wyatt pushed away from the table, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards as he grabbed his hat. "I'll check the herd." Lenora's hand found his sleeve. Just a brush enough to pull him back for a heartbeat. "Wyatt." Her voice was soft, but held a gravity that pinned him to the floor. "You stand where others break. That's what the boys see. That's what I see." He swallowed hard, wishing he had something good to give her in return. Instead, he pressed his rough palm over her fingers. "I'm trying, Lenora. I swear I am." She nodded once and let him go dot by the time he reached the south pasture. The sun was high and his shirt stuck to his back. Caleb and Micah trudged behind him, each lugging an empty feed pail too big for their thin arms. They didn't complain, didn't whine about the sweat or the blisters. Wyatt couldn't help but smile at their stubborn pride. They reached the old split rail pen where the cattle milled about, ribs too visible under shaggy coats. Not much meat left on them, but they were all he had. Wyatt set his boots wide, poured grain from the burlap sack in steady scoops. Caleb did the same, the feed barely trickling from his small hands. "You're doing good," Wyatt said, his voice rough. Micah tugged on his sleeve. "Pa?" "Yeah, son." "When you gonna fix the barn roof?" Wyatt barked a laugh that turned brittle at the edges. "When the money comes in. Is money why Ma cries sometimes?" The question hit him square in the ribs. He paused, the scoop heavy in his palm. He knelt to the boy's level. "Your Ma's strong. Stronger than me most days. She don't break easy, no matter how hard the wind blows." Micah nodded wide-eyed. "You're strong too." Wyatt ruffled his hair, but the words scraped like grit in his throat. "Hope that's enough." When they finished, he herded the boys back toward the house, the dust caking his boots like old regret. The twins raced ahead, their laughter bright. But every step back to the house felt heavier. He found Lenora on the porch, mending one of the boys' shirts. She tilted her head toward the sound of their boots. "They help?" "Like they were born to it," Wyatt said. "You should have seen Micah chase off a coyote with nothing but a stick." She laughed, the sound cutting through the knot in his chest. "He takes after you." "God help him," Wyatt muttered. He sat beside her, elbows on his knees. She worked the needle through the fabric by feel alone, the thread weaving strong where it had once frayed. He watched the motion, hypnotized by its quiet strength. "Jeb's not gonna let go," he said. "Men like him, they don't know how. Then he'll learn." Her voice didn't waver. Wyatt reached for her hand. She stilled, letting him lace his fingers through hers. For a long while they sat like that, the boys playing in the yard, the sun dipping low behind the hills. "You think I'm doing right?" "By you?" he asked, voice raw. She turned her blind eyes to him, her thumb tracing the back of his hand. "You stand where others run. You fight when the world says fold. That's enough for me." And for a moment, sitting on that splintered porch with her hand in his, Wyatt let himself believe it was true. Night came with a chill wind and the smell of distant rain. Wyatt lay on the cot, boots tucked under, the revolver within reach. The boys slept deep in their makeshift bed beside Lenora. He could hear her humming again, soft and low, the tune carrying the promise that tomorrow would come whether they were ready or not. He closed his eyes and tried to picture a spring when the grass would grow thick again, the cattle would fatten, the barn roof wouldn't leak like a sieve. He imagined Lenora standing at the edge of the porch, blindfold gone, eyes shining. Impossible, maybe, but worth the fight. As sleep tugged him under, Wyatt whispered to the dark, to the walls, to the ghosts of the land that refused to break him. "Yet, I'm still here. I ain't done." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but the house stood. And so did he. Morning came wrapped in the hush before a storm. Wyatt woke to the faint drumming of rain on the patched roof, a sound that should have brought relief after weeks of dry heat. But all it brought him was a knot in his chest that no amount of work could untie. He rose from his cot before Lenora or the boys stirred, pulling on his coat against the chill seeping through the cracks in the walls. He stood for a moment at the threshold of their bedroom, watching the rise and fall of their breathing in the faint lamplight. Lenora's hand rested on Micah's back, her thumb moving in the smallest circles as if comforting him even in sleep. Wyatt slipped out before the floorboards could betray him. The barn door creaked under his hand, the hinges screaming like they hadn't been oiled in years. He fed the cattle, counted them twice, eyes scanning for signs of sickness or worse. Another lean calf, ribs showing through a hide too thin for the coming cold. When he returned to the house, the smell of frying flour and weak coffee greeted him. Lenora was by the stove, the boys crowding her sides, each one offering too many hands and questions for her to keep up with. She laughed when Caleb nearly dropped a tin plate, her voice warm enough to soften the morning's hard edges. "You should have woken me," Wyatt said, shrugging out of his coat. He bent to lift Micah, the boy's arms twining around his neck like vines. Lenora turned her blind eyes toward him. "And let you start the day without a warm belly? Not likely." He set Micah down with a playful swat to the backside, earning a giggle that made something in Wyatt's chest tug loose. "Coffee's strong enough to float a horseshoe today," he said, tipping his cup to his lips. "You're welcome," she grinned. "Eat, you'll need your strength." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "I sent the boys to fetch what's left of the old seed." Wyatt froze mid-sip. "Seed? Lenora, the ground's too dry. That rain out there, it won't last." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Then it won't last." "But it's hope, Wyatt. Better we try than sit here waiting for the land to bury us." He lowered his cup, staring at her across the small kitchen. "We'll run through what little we got. And if we don't plant now, we run through it anyway." She stepped closer, her voice dropping low enough the boys couldn't hear. "I didn't come here to watch you stand in an empty field and wish for a miracle." He let out a breath, long and tired. "You're stubborn as an old mule." She tilted her head, a smile ghost in her mouth. "Takes one to know one." The boys reappeared, arms laden with burlap sacks that looked twice as heavy as they were worth. Caleb dropped his at Wyatt's boots, chest heaving. "Pa, we can help, right?" Wyatt looked at Lenora. She nodded once, sure as sunrise. "Yeah, Wyatt," said finally, "you can help." They worked the fields that afternoon, rain soaking them to the bone. Lenora knelt in the wet soil beside the boys, guiding their small hands by touch, planting each seed like a promise. Wyatt turned the earth with the old hoe, his shoulders screaming protest, but he didn't stop. He looked at her, hair plastered to her forehead, dressum caked in mud, and saw someone braver than he'd ever been. The wind picked up, driving sheets of rain sideways across the open field. Caleb shivered but didn't complain, and when Micah's teeth started to chatter, Lenora pulled him into her lap, wrapping him in her shawl until his breathing slowed. "We're done for today," Wyatt called over the storm, voice hoarse. "Inside, all of you." Lenora's mouth opened to protest, but she felt the tremor in Micah's shoulders and swallowed her words. Together they trudged back to the house, leaving footprints that filled with water before they'd reached the porch dot inside. Wyatt stoked the stove until the flames licked high enough to warm every chilled bone in the room. Lenora stripped the boys' wet clothes, wrapping them in old blankets, her hands moving with the same steady calm that had gotten them this far. She caught Wyatt watching, his hair dripping rain onto the floor. "What?" she asked, a challenge hidden under the softness. "Nothing," he said. "Just glad you didn't listen when I told you not to come," she snorted, low and warm. "Wouldn't be much of a wife if I did." His chest squeezed at that word wife. Not a transaction, not a burden, but a partner standing shoulder to shoulder while the world tried to drown them both. When the boys finally fell asleep, the house went quiet, but for the steady patter of rain on the patched roof. Wyatt sank into the chair by the stove, boots kicked off, socks steaming by the hearth. Lenora found her way to him, her hands brushing his knee, then his shoulder. "We'll make it," she said, though her voice trembled at the edges. "I don't know how, but we will." He caught her wrist, brought her palm to his chest, let her feel the heartbeat that refused to quit. "Long as you stand with me." Her lips curved into a smile he could feel, even if she never opened her eyes. Always. Outside, the storm raged. But in the warmth of that battered house, Wyatt Coulter believed, just for tonight, that maybe standing was enough. Dawn came cold and clear, the storm leaving behind a hush that settled deep in the bones of the Coulter land. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into the mud that yesterday's rain had left behind. The sky was a hard, perfect blue mocking. Almost because it made no promises. The ground still looked dry beneath the skin of damp earth dot behind him. Lenora's voice drifted through the half-open door. "You standing there won't dry your boots any faster." He almost smiled, but it caught on the barbed wire of his worry. "Just checking the field." She stepped out beside him, barefoot, the hem of her skirt brushing mud. "You can't see it all from here. And you can?" He teased, but there was no bite in it. She turned her blind eyes toward him, the rising sun painting the side of her face. "Gold, I feel it. Same way I feel when you're carrying too much." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just took her hand and held it there against his chest, letting the steady thud of his heartbeat say the rest. They spent the morning working side by side. Wyatt guided the boys back into the field, showing them how to tamp the seeds into the soil with small, careful steps. Lenora followed the rows with her bare feet, testing the furrows for gaps and pressing the dirt down with her hands. She looked like something the land itself had conjured, rooted, certain, even. When the wind picked up grit and flung it into her face, around midday, Caleb found an old arrowhead buried deep in the field. He brought it to Wyatt like a holy relic, his small hands cupped tight around it. "Pa, look, Indian stone." Wyatt knelt, brushing the flint clean. "Where'd you find this?" "By Ma," Caleb said, "where she was pressing the rose." Lenora tilted her head, listening. "Arrowhead? Guess folks were fighting for this dirt long before we did," Wyatt murmured. She smiled faintly. "And we're still standing." Caleb's eyes shone. "Can I keep it?" Wyatt pressed the arrowhead back into his son's palm. "Reckon it's yours now. Might bring us luck." "We don't need luck," Lenora said, rising from her crouch. "We have us." By evening, the boys were sprawled out on the front step, boots caked in mud, their chatter fading into yawns. Wyatt stood at the edge of the yard, staring at the distant ridge where Jeb Rollins had last shown his grinning face. The horizon looked peaceful, but he knew better. Men like Jeb didn't vanish. They waited, coiled like rattlers in dry grass. Lenora's hand found his back. She didn't say a word. She just pressed her palm there, warm through his thin shirt, like an anchor. "I know he'll come back," Wyatt said finally, his voice low. "Men like him don't take no easy." "Then we'll say no again," she said. He looked at her, at the bruises the wind had left on her cheeks, at the tiny smile that never seemed to break even when the world tried to crush it. "What if it's not enough? Then we say it louder," she said. "And if that's not enough, we stand together, same as now." The boys had fallen asleep on the steps. Wyatt bent to scoop them up, one in each arm. They barely stirred, limp as kittens. Lenora opened the door for him, her fingers brushing the back of his neck as he passed. That small touch carried him through the darkness of the house like a lantern. Later, after the boys were tucked into the warm cocoon of old quilts, Wyatt found Lenora sitting at the table, running her fingers over a piece of paper worn thin at the creases. He recognized it immediately, the bank notice, the one that had stolen his sleep more nights than he'd admit. He dropped into the chair across from her. "You shouldn't waste your worry on that." "It's not waste," she said, voice soft but unyielding. "It's knowing what we stand to lose." "And what's that?" he asked, bitter. "A roof full of holes? A barn that won't hold out through one more winter?" Her hands moved across the paper, folding it until it was no bigger than a matchbox. "No, it's this table, those boys. Your voice in the morning, my hands knowing you'll be here when I wake. That's what we stand to lose." He looked at her. Really looked. Her hair, still damp from the rain. Her dress, patched at the elbows. Her blindfold, tied neat but frayed at the edges. And her face, all of it, carved by the same grit that had carved him. He reached across the table, took her hand in his. "If Rollins comes back, I'll face him. If the bank comes, I'll stand in that yard until they drag me out by my boots. But I'll be damned if I let him break us." She turned her palm up, lacing their fingers tight. "Then they won't." Outside, the wind rose again, whistling through the eaves like a warning. Wyatt squeezed her hand tighter. "Promise me something." "Name it. When it gets bad, and it will. You know it. Promise me you won't stand alone." She laughed, but there was no mirth in it. "I wouldn't know how." He leaned across the table and pressed his forehead to hers. The paper crumpled between their joined hands. They sat like that until the lamp burned low, until the shadows stretched long across the walls, until the wind outside was the only thing left making noise in that battered old house that somehow, some way, was still a home. The next morning dawned bitter and gray. Frost glazed the porch boards, and when Wyatt stepped out, his breath rose in little white ghosts that drifted toward the hills. He had always liked this hour before the sun claimed the land for itself, when he could pretend, if only for a heartbeat, that there was enough time to fix everything. Inside he heard Lenora's voice, low and gentle, humming the boys awake. That sound made him stand a little straighter. gripped the railing a little tighter. It made the weight of the banknotes in his pocket feel like something he could bear a while longer. He set about the morning chores with the boys, trailing behind him like loyal shadows. They fed the chickens, repaired a loose hinge on the gate, hauled water from the well, even though the rope burned their palms raw. Micah whined when the wind cut through his coat. Wyatt ruffled his hair, the roughness gentler than it looked. "World don't care about soft hands, son," he said, handing him a fresh pail. "But it'll remember strong ones." Micah nodded, big eyes round and solemn, and Wyatt felt something tighten in his chest. He looked over at Caleb, who was dragging the feed sack twice his size toward the barn. It should have made him proud. It did. But there was guilt there too, two boys working like grown men before their time. He caught Lenora watching them from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself to keep the cold at bay. She looked every bit the widow Dry Creek still called her behind her back, thin, blind, worn down by wind and worry. But he knew better. He'd seen her push through storms. Bigger than this farm, her hands steady when his own had threatened to fail him. After the chores, they gathered at the table for bread and leftover stew. The boys devoured it like wolves, bits of crust clinging to their chins. Lenora sat quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, reading the crease in her brow better than any letter. "The sheriff," she said, voice flat. "I heard his horse by the fence this morning." Wyatt's shoulders tensed. "Cole, what did he want?" She shrugged, blind eyes turning toward the window. "Didn't say. But he didn't come up to the porch. Just sat there for a while, then turned back toward town." Wyatt scrubbed a hand across his mouth. "He's sniffing around 'cause of Jeb, probably hoping to catch me in some lie about the deed." Lenora's fingers stilled. "Or maybe he's waiting for you to swing first so he can call it just." He looked at her, the way the light caught the edges of her hair, the faint bruise of sleepless nights under her blindfold. "I'm not looking for trouble. You're not," she agreed. "But it's looking for you, for us." The boys watched them, wide-eyed and too quiet. Wyatt reached for Micah's bowl, ladled him another spoonful he didn't need, just to feel like he could give something. "We'll finish the planting tomorrow," he said finally. "Then we'll see what the land gives us." Lenora's mouth curved in a ghost of a smile. "The land doesn't give, Wyatt. It trades." He wished he knew what he had. Left to offer by late afternoon, the sky had turned mean. Clouds bunched up like fists above the ridge. Wyatt hitched the old plow mule to the stump near the barn, giving her neck a tired pat. He turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway, coat 2 sizes too big, hat slipping over his eyes. "Pa," he said, voice low, "there's men by the creek." Wyatt's chest went cold. "What men?" "Strangers, they got rifles." He didn't wait. He crossed the yard in 5 long strides, hand hovering near the old revolver tucked into his belt. From the edge of the field, he saw them 3 men on horseback, huddled near the creek bed like wolves over a kill. Jeb Rawlins was there, unmistakable. In his battered duster and grin that never reached his eyes, Wyatt didn't move closer. He stood tall, boots planted in the sucking mud, letting them see him. One of the strangers tipped his hat. Jeb only spat into the grass. "Afternoon, Coulter," Jeb called, voice bright as broken glass. "Fine piece of land you got here. Shame about the note." Wyatt didn't answer. He'd learned that from Lenora. Sometimes silence cut sharper than a blade. Jeb clicked his tongue, turned to his companions. "See, man's got no manners." One of the others laughed, low and mean. Wyatt's fists curled at his sides, but he kept them down. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of swinging first. "You best ride on," he called back, calm as he could manage. "Ain't nothing for you here." Jeb's grin widened. "Oh, I reckon there is. Bank says they'll take this land if the note ain't paid. Maybe I'd buy it myself. Fix the place up nice. Put your pretty wife in a house she deserves." Wyatt felt the words hit like a slap. He forced himself to stand still. Behind him, he knew the boys were watching. He could feel Lenora's presence in the doorway, even if she hadn't stepped out. "You ride on now," he said again, the tremor gone from his voice. "Ain't no home for you here." Jeb leaned forward, elbows on his saddle horn. "Funny thing about homes, Coulter. Sometimes you build them with a hammer. Sometimes with a match." Wyatt felt the threat plain as daylight. "This place burns. It burns with you in it." The laughter that followed was cut short by a distant roll of thunder. Jeb tugged his reins, turned his horse back toward the hills. The other men followed, their silhouettes swallowed by the gathering dark. Wyatt stood there long after they vanished. The creek bubbled behind him, a whisper of life that felt fragile as a match flame in the wind. That night, they sat by the hearth while the boys dozed on a pallet of old quilts. Lenora's hands wrapped around her mug, thumb tracing the rim again. And again. "He won't stop," Wyatt said. "He'll push till there's nothing left to push." Lenora tilted her head. "Then we don't break." He shook his head, staring at the fire's flickering glow. "What if we're already broken?" Her hand found his knee, warm and steady. "You don't fix a thing by wishing it whole. You fix it by using what you got left." He covered her hand with his own, pressing her fingers to the old scar that ran across his palm. "I'm not afraid to fight." "I know," she said softly. "That's why you won't lose." And for one more night, Wyatt Coulter let himself believe that the wind might come, the debt might come, but they would still be standing when the dawn broke cold and clear again. Morning crawled across the Coulter place like a cautious promise. The storm had come and gone in the night, leaving behind a damp hush that settled into the walls, the fields, the hollows of Wyatt's bones. He sat at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, studying the ledger that mocked him with its crooked columns and missing sums. Lenora moved quietly around him, her hands brushing past the tin of coffee grounds, the cracked mug she liked best. Her blindfold was loose today, the ends tucked into her braid so it wouldn't catch on the stove. Wyatt watched her fingers, quick and certain, measuring by touch. He wondered, not for the first time, how she never seemed to miss what she'd lost. She set the mug down near his hand. "You'll burn holes in that paper if you glare at it much longer." He grunted, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Might be easier than paying it. She traced the ledger's edge, fingertips, grazing the ink smudges. "The boys are still asleep. You should rest too." Wyatt leaned back, scrubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Rest don't make numbers add up. Worry doesn't either." She tilted her face toward him, listening for the small betrayals. In his voice that he never heard himself. "What did Jeb say yesterday? The truth, not what you tell the boys." He hesitated. The memory of Rawlins and his men, the way they'd watched the house like wolves testing a fence, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up all over again, same as always. Hinted he'll take this place when the bank comes. Maybe sooner. Lenora's hand found his, thumb brushing the rough scar at the base of his thumb. "And you told him?" "I told him I'd bury him under the south fence if he tried." She didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft hum that might have been a laugh. "Good." Outside, the boards creaked under small feet. Caleb's sleepy voice came from the doorway. "Ma, Pa, there's a wagon on the ridge." Wyatt was on his feet before he realized he'd moved. He crossed to the door, peering past the boy's shoulder. Sure enough, a dark shape crested the far rise, crawling slow as a beetle down the road. "Stay inside," he told Caleb, his voice sharper than he meant. He felt the boy stiffen, knot against his leg. He stepped onto the porch, boots heavy on the boards slick with last night's rain. The wagon drew closer until he could make out two figures, a man driving, another hunched under a blanket in the back. Not Rawlins, not Cole, but trouble just the same. Wyatt could feel it like a splinter under his skin. When the wagon stopped, the driver called out before Wyatt could open his mouth. "Mornin', Coulter. Got a letter for you," Wyatt frowned. "From who?" The man shrugged, flicking the reins at the mule. "Didn't ask. Just told to deliver it quick." Wyatt stepped down into the mud. The man handed him an envelope, sealed with red wax that had cracked in the cold. He didn't recognize the mark. He turned it over in his palm before looking back up. "You ride for the bank?" The driver shook his head. "Don't ride for anyone but the road. Good luck to you." He flicked the reins again, and the wagon rattled off, leaving a churned mess of hoof prints and worry behind. Wyatt stood there, staring at the letter like it might bite. He felt Lenora's presence before he heard her steps on the porch. "You going to open it?" she asked. He tucked it into his coat. "Not here, not now." She tilted her head, reading the truth he didn't say. "You want me to read it too?" "You?" He almost laughed. "Funny, huh? Man like me, strong enough to haul a plow through hardpan, but too chicken to read 6 lines of ink." Lenora slipped her hand through the crook of his arm. "Not chicken. Just tired of bad news." They stepped back inside together. The boys hovered by the hearth, eyes round. Wyatt gave them what he hoped was a reassuring nod. "Go help your ma with breakfast. I'll be out back." He led Lenora to the barn, the smell of damp hay wrapping around them like a faded blanket. He handed her the letter and watched as her fingers found the edge, broke the wax with a careful snap dot. She read in a low voice, each word landing like a stone. It was from the bank, but not the local branch. Someone higher up a name Wyatt didn't know. An offer, if you could call it that. Sell now cheap and clear the debt before they claimed the land outright. When she finished, he sank onto a hay bale, elbows braced on his knees. "They think they're doing me a kindness." Lenora folded the letter, slipped it into his coat pocket like she was burying it. "They think you'll break, that you'll run." He looked up at her, at the halo of pale light that turned the frayed ends of her blindfold into threads of silver. "Maybe I should. Maybe dragging you and the boys through this. Don't you dare." Her voice cut through the damp air, sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't you put that on yourself. This is our fight, not just yours." Wyatt let out a breath that tasted like iron. "What if the land's not enough, Lenora? What if all this sweat, all this hope, what if it just swallows us?" She crouched in front of him, her knees pressing into the straw. "Then we let it swallow us together, and we push our roots down so deep they choke on us." He barked a laugh that cracked at the edges. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple." Her hands rose, framing his face, thumb brushing the smudge of dirt on his jaw. "But right." They spent the rest of the day working the field where the arrowhead had come up. Wyatt pushed the old plow until his back screamed, the boys trailing after with buckets of seed. Lenora sat on the fence rail, calling out the rows, marking the crooked lines with a stick so they didn't overlap. Every so often, her voice would break into a hum, low and sure, and it gave him more strength than any meal ever could. When dusk came, they sat together on the porch, sweat drying on their shirts. The boys curled at their feet like tired pups. Wyatt stared out at the furrows, the soil turned and seeded, the promise buried under the skin of the earth. He felt Lenora's shoulder press into his. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The hush between them was heavy, but not empty, somewhere. In that silence, Wyatt realized that no letter, no sheriff, no bankman waiting with chains could take what they'd built here. Not if they stood. Not if they kept planting, even when the land threatened to bury them. And as the first stars pricked through the velvet dark, he let that truth settle deep in his chest, a seed he'd guard with every bone he had left. The morning after the letter, Wyatt rose before the rooster had time to crow. He found himself standing at the edge of the field, boots sunk into the soft dirt they'd turned just days ago. The furrows looked fragile in the dawn light thin, veins of hope cutting through land that wanted to forget how to grow anything at all. Behind him, the house creaked awake. He could hear the boys squabbling over a single egg to split, the clink of the battered tin cups on the table. Lenora's voice wove through it, all like a thread steady patient, pulling their ragged edges back together before they could fray too far. He knelt, scooped up a handful of dirt. It clung to his palm like a promise. Or a warning, can't. Plant more than you can tend, he muttered. Words his father used to say, words he'd ignored more times than he cared to admit. He let the dirt slip through his fingers, watched it scatter on the wind. Inside, the warmth of the house swallowed him whole. Lenora was by the stove, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up at the shift of his boots on the floorboards. Cold out there? She asked. Colder than it should be, he said, shrugging off his coat. He hung it on the peg, fingers brushing the old shotgun propped beside the door. He felt her listening. Jeb's not fool enough to come in daylight, she said, as if reading his thoughts. Fool enough to push me until I'm the one swinging first. Wyatt grumbled. Lenora crossed to him, wiped a smear of dirt from his jaw with her thumb. And what does that get him? He hesitated. A story. The story he wants. Poor old Wyatt Coulter. Too wild to hold what he's got. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're not that man anymore. The boys scrambled to the table, Micah dragging the old ledger behind him like a trophy. Pa, we can help. Ma showed us how to count the sacks. Wyatt forced a grin, ruffled the boy's hair. You two are worth more than all the seed in the county. Caleb beamed. We can scare off Jeb too. Wyatt's chest twisted. That's not your job, boy. That's mine. But Lenora was already kneeling beside Caleb, her hand on his small back. You stand by your pa by growing strong. That's your fight now. They ate what little they had in silence, broken by Caleb's questions and Micah's chatter about birds nesting under the porch eaves. Wyatt listened with half an ear, the other half tuned to the wind outside, the distant echo of hoofbeats that weren't their dash yet. They spent the day mending what could be mended. Wyatt and the boys patched the chicken coop, hammered a new brace onto the barn door that sagged under its own tired weight. Lenora sat on an upturned crate, sewing a split seam in Wyatt's only good coat. Looks like it's been through a war, she said, threading the needle by touch. He leaned on the fence post watching her. It has, and so have we. She didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth softened. Still standing. Still standing, he echoed. When the sun dropped low, Wyatt sent the boys in first. He lingered by the fence, scanning the hills. He half expected to see Jeb there, waiting at the edge of the dusk like a ghost that refused to be buried. But the land stayed empty, just wind and brush and the promise of another hard night. Inside, he found Lenora at the table, her fingers smoothing a scrap of paper, flat against the worn wood. He knew that paper by heart, the letter. The threat. Dressed up like mercy. Burn it, he said. It's worth less than ash. She traced the edge one more time before folding it into her palm. Not yet, let me hold it. Remind me what we're fighting for. He crossed the room, knelt beside her. We're fighting for more than this dirt, Lenora. She nodded. No, but this dirt is where we stand, where our boys stand. He rested his head against her knee, her free hand settling on his hair like a blessing. The fire cracked behind them, the wind rattled the shutter, and for that moment he could almost believe the fight was one they could win. That night, he lay awake long after the boys had curled up beside the hearth, long after Lenora's breathing steadied into the deep calm of sleep. He watched the moon crawl across the floorboards, inch by inch, as if it were marking time against their debts. At some point he rose, careful not to wake her, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit deep. He liked it that way, pain reminded him he was still here, still holding his ground. From the ridge, a coyote called. Wyatt's hand drifted to the shotgun, but he didn't lift it. Let the wild things come, he thought. Let them test the fences. Let them see the man standing behind them. He felt the floorboards shift. Lenora's shape, draped in her old shawl, appeared beside him. Barefoot, blindfold, askew, hair tangled from sleep. "You're freezing," she murmured. "Couldn't rest." He said. She tucked herself under his arm like she belonged there, which she did. "Then stand here with me. If the wind comes, let it find both of us." He pressed his mouth to her hair, tasted the salt of her skin, the truth in her nearness. They stood there together until the moon was high, until the cold dug into their bones, until the fear slipped from his shoulders just enough for him to remember what they were fighting for. And when they finally turned back to the warmth inside, Wyatt glanced at the fields hidden by the dark and thought, "Tomorrow we plant more. Tomorrow we stand taller. Let Jeb come. Let the bank come. Let the wind blow the roof clean off this house if it wants." Long as they stood together, there'd be something worth rebuilding. The dawn that followed came soft, the kind that promised more than it gave. Wyatt woke to the smell of the earth, the sour, sweet bite of damp wood and the faint curl of smoke from the kitchen stove. He rolled off the cot, his boots thumping onto the splintered floorboards like the steady beat of a drum that refused to quit. Lenora's voice drifted from the back room, low and patient, guiding Caleb through the slow business of learning letters. Wyatt paused in the doorway, leaning his shoulder against the frame. The boy's brow was furrowed, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth as he traced each letter on the scrap of paper Lenora held flat for him. Caleb murmured, uncertainty riding his voice. "That's right," Lenora said, her smile clear in her tone, even if her eyes never saw the page. "C for Caleb and Coulter, and can't nobody take this land if we stand our ground." Wyatt's chest tightened around something half broken, half mended. He cleared his throat. "You'll wear a hole through that pencil if you press any harder, boy." Caleb looked up, beaming. "Mao says if I learn my letters, I can help with the books." "Smart woman," Wyatt said, glancing at Lenora. She tilted her head just enough for him to feel the heat in her unspoken reply. Micah burst in from the yard then, his face smudged with dirt. "Pa! There's a rider on the ridge, by the fence line." Wyatt's gut clenched like a fist. "You?" "Sure." Micah nodded wide-eyed. "Looks like one of Rawlins' men." Lenora didn't flinch. She only reached for Wyatt's hand. "You gonna stand here, or you gonna meet him at the fence?" Wyatt bent and pressed a kiss to her hair. "Keep." The boys' clothes. Outside, the sky stretched gray and mean over the raw bones of their field. Wyatt grabbed the old shotgun from the peg and checked the shells with fingers that moved steady, even as his heart rattled against his ribs. The rider was waiting at the far fence post when Wyatt reached him. A skinny man with a crooked hat and a grin that was more nervous than cruel. "Morning, Coulter," the man drawled. He spat into the dirt between them. "Jeb wants a word." Wyatt planted his boots in the mud, the barrels of the shotgun glinting in the dull light. "Jeb's got plenty of words. He can bring 'em himself." The man shifted in his saddle, his grin slipping. "Says he ain't setting foot near your house again till you see sense. Says he's offering you a chance to walk away clean." Wyatt felt the wind cut through his coat, cold and honest. "You tell Jeb Rawlins he wants my land. He comes and takes it himself. And when he does, he better bring more than you and that sorry grin." The man opened his mouth, but Wyatt lifted the shotgun a hair, and that was enough. The rider tugged his reins and turned back toward the hills without another word. Wyatt watched him go until the figure shrank into the bramble and was gone. The field stretched before him, furrows carved deep, seeds buried under frost and prayer. He rested the shotgun across his shoulder and trudged back toward the house. Inside, the boys were huddled around Lenora's skirt, eyes wide. Caleb spoke first. "Did he come to take us?" Wyatt shook his head, slow and sure. "Nobody's taking you anywhere. Not while I got breath in my chest." Lenora stepped forward, her hand finding the scar on his jaw, thumb brushing the stubble. "There. He's testing you, trying to see if you'll run." Wyatt let out a rough laugh. "Well, then he's wasting his damn time." She smiled small but fierce. Good. The rest of the day passed in the quiet kind of work that held them together. Wyatt chopped the last of the winter wood, his muscles burning with the sweet ache of purpose. Lenora boiled the dried beans. She'd saved for lean days, humming under her breath as she tasted for salt. The boys fought over who got the last heel of bread, then settled in the yard to carve shapes in the frozen dirt with broken sticks. When the sun slipped behind the hills, Wyatt poured himself a half cup of weak coffee and sat on the porch steps. He watched the fields where the new green shoots strained against the cold, small as the hairs on a dog's back but alive, stubborn as their keeper. Lenora joined him, her shawl pulled tight. She sat so close he could feel her warmth through the chill. For a long while they said nothing, just watched the darkness settle like a blanket across the land. Finally, she spoke. "How long do you think before the bank sends their man again?" Wyatt's jaw worked. "Soon. They'll come with papers and polite threats. And when that don't work, they'll come with chains." Her hand slipped into his, the calluses of her palm catching on his own rough skin. "Then we stand at the fence together." He looked at her, really looked. The tired lines, the worn edges, the fire that never went out in her. He thought about the ledger on the shelf, the arrowhead Caleb kept under his pillow for luck, the way Micah still sucked his thumb when the wind howled too loud. "We stand," he said, his voice so low it nearly broke on the word. "We stand, that." Night. Wyatt dreamt of the fields full and green, of Lenora laughing under a sun that didn't burn or freeze, of the boys running through tall grass taller than their shoulders. He woke to the creak of the house settling, the hush of the world. Outside, holding its breath, he lay there, listening to Lenora's breathing, the slow heartbeat of a promise that hadn't been broken yet. He knew dawn would come hard, with more fences to mend, more lies to swat away like flies. He knew Jeb would circle back like a wolf testing a door. But as long as they kept the door barred and their backs pressed together, the wind could howl all it liked, the land would hold. And so would they. Wyatt woke before the first rooster crowed. The world was still blue-black and waiting, the house so quiet he could hear Lenora's soft breathing and the creak of old wood sighing against the wind. He sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the boots he'd left by the door. The leather was cracked, seams threatening to split like a wound that refused to heal. His mind churned with half-formed plans and dead ends. He'd tried talking to the banker again yesterday, rode all the way into town, hat in hand, throat dry from swallowing pride. The answer had been the same: sign the deed, take a pittance, be grateful for the mercy of men who'd never set foot in these fields. Mercy. He spat the taste of it out before pulling his boots on. He heard a rustle behind him. Lenora's voice was a whisper wrapped in a smile. "You're up too early." "Couldn't sleep." "Bad dreams?" "Only the waking." "Kind." She sat up, hair falling over her shoulder. She looked like the girl she'd been years ago, before the train accident that took her sight and carved the world into shapes. She couldn't see but could feel better than anyone. He watched her reach for his hand like she always did, finding him unerringly in the dark. "You keep carrying the whole barn on your back, Wyatt Coulter. It'll crush you." He squeezed her fingers. "Someone has to carry it." She leaned forward until her forehead rested on his shoulder, her breath warm through his shirt. "Then let me carry it too." By mid-morning, the boys were out in the yard, whooping and chasing the stray dog that had taken to sleeping by their porch. Wyatt mended a loose rail by the goat pen while Lenora sat nearby, sewing a tear in Caleb's only good shirt. "You see Cole in town?" she asked without looking up. He grunted. "Sheriff's been sniffing around Rawlins again. Says he's keeping the peace. Funny how peace looks an awful lot like you standing alone at the fence line." Wyatt drove the nail home. With a crack. Ain't no law out here that wasn't paid for twice. Lenora's fingers paused on the needle, so we buy our own. He looked at her, brow furrowed. With what? She smiled, small but sharp. Not gold, truth. We make the town see him for what he is. Town don't care, Nora. Then we make him care. They spent the afternoon pulling weeds from the tender shoots near the back field. Caleb and Micah hauled water in rusted buckets, sloshing half of it onto their boots, but never once complaining. Wyatt worked in silence, but his eyes never stopped scanning the ridge dot. It was near sundown when they heard it. Hoofbeats, distant but steady. Wyatt rose, wiping sweat and dirt onto his pants. He motioned the boys inside. Lenora stood behind him, her hand at his elbow. Rollins didn't bother with messengers this time. He came himself, flanked by two riders who looked mean enough to chew nails and spit rust. "Evening, Coulter," Jeb called, like they were neighbors catching up over fence. "Posts instead of enemies." "Jeb," Wyatt said flatly. Jeb dismounted with a flourish. His boots crunched on the dry grass. "Heard you went begging at the bank. How'd that go?" Wyatt's jaw flexed. "Same as it'll go for you. Town's tired of your stink," Jeb laughed. "Town don't care, friend. They care about cattle. Prices and whiskey, not you." Lenora stepped forward then, her chin lifted, blindfold tied neat and defiant. "You're wrong." Jeb turned, surprised. "Miss Coulter. Didn't know you had it in you to speak up." Her voice was like iron wrapped in velvet. "You don't know half of what I've got. Or what Wyatt's got." One of Jeb's men spat. On the ground. "Ain't none of this yours soon, missy." "Bank says so." She didn't flinch. "Bank's made of paper. This land's made of bone." Jeb's grin slipped for a breath. "You think a fancy speech keeps me from what's mine?" Wyatt stepped forward then, close enough that he could smell the sour edge of whiskey on Jeb's coat. "You want it, you come for it yourself. No threats, no papers, just you and me." Jeb's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping enough for Wyatt to see what was really there. Fear dressed up as cruelty. "You'll break first," Jeb said, mounting up. "Cold's coming. Seed's too thin. Boys'll starve before spring." Wyatt's fists curled, but Lenora's hand slid into his stilling. Let him ride, Wyatt. Let him ride." Jeb tipped his hat mockingly and wheeled his horse around. The three of them rode off, dust kicking up behind them like ghosts fleeing the grave. That night, the wind rose hard, rattling the boards and howling down the chimney. Wyatt sat by the window, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Lenora came to him, blanket draped around her shoulders. She touched his jaw, guiding his gaze back to her. "He's losing, Wyatt." "Feels like we are." She shook her head. "He's louder 'cause he's desperate. He knows you'll outlast him." He closed his eyes. "What if I can't?" Her thumb brushed the scar on his palm. "Then we do it together. We break together. We heal together." He leaned his forehead to hers, the wind a chorus outside that couldn't drown out her whisper. "Let him come." Lenora's smile was soft and sharp all at once. "We're ready." And in that battered house that creaked like old bone, Wyatt Coulter felt the truth settle deeper than fear. The fence line might bend. The field might fail. But they would not. The storm blew in hard the next morning, a ragged howl that made the shutters rattle like old bones. Wyatt stood in the doorway, coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He watched the snow begin to swirl over the fields, covering the tender shoots they'd coaxed up from parched earth. It felt like watching a promise get buried alive. Behind him, Lenora's voice wrapped around the fear the wind brought. "Weather'll break, always does." He didn't turn. "Not always in our favor." She moved to his side, found his elbow with her fingers. "Favors don't grow here. We make our own." He let out a low laugh that held more ache than mirth. "You're too good for this place, Nora. And you're too stubborn to let it go," she said. her lips brushing his shoulder through the worn wool. "So we're even." Inside, the boys were huddled by the hearth, feeding the fire with scraps of wood too small to patch anything but good enough to keep the cold at bay. Micah's voice piped up, all bright against the gloom. "Pa, you think we can ride into town tomorrow? See the general store?" Wyatt felt that question settle like a stone in his chest. "If the road's clear." Lenora's hand slid down his arm to squeeze his palm. He squeezed back, grateful for that tether. By midday, the wind had sharpened into needles, driving drifts up against the barn doors. Wyatt, bundled in his threadbare coat, wrestled with the old latch while Caleb braced the boards with his small shoulders. "Push, boy!" Wyatt barked over the roar. Together, they forced it closed. The smell of cold cattle and straw wrapped around them, a bitter comfort. "Pa, how long the snow gonna stay?" Caleb asked, nose red as an apple. Wyatt pushed his hat back and crouched. "Long as it wants. But we'll wait it out like always." Caleb looked at him with that same wide-eyed hope Lenora wore like armor. "You reckon Jeb's hiding from it too?" Wyatt grunted. "Men like him don't care about weather. But he'll care when his belly's empty." Caleb giggled, muffling it with his mitten. Wyatt mussed his hair, feeling some small spark of warmth in the middle of all this white. Night fell heavy. The house rattled and shuddered, wind clawing at every crack. Wyatt sat by the window again, shotgun across his knees. He could feel Lenora's presence before he heard her feet shuffle across the floor. "You're gonna wear a hole through that glass, staring so hard," she teased, easing down beside him. He grunted. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit." He smiled barely. "Thought you liked my mind." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love your mind, even when it forgets how to rest." The fire popped behind them. Micah stirred in his sleep, little hands clutching the old quilt Lenora had stitched together their first year here. The pieces were a patchwork of every good moment they'd fought to keep. "Snow won't last," Lenora said again, voice quiet. "But you will, we will." Wyatt's jaw tightened. "And if Rollins uses it to come up on us quiet, then we stand in the snow same as we stand in the sun," she said. Fierce and soft all at once. In the gray wash of dawn, Wyatt found tracks by the fence, fresh, sharp where hooves had pressed down the powdery crust. He crouched low, brushing the edge with his gloved fingers. They weren't stray cattle. They weren't his. He scanned the tree line. Nothing but bare branches and the hush of falling flakes. But he felt eyes out there, felt them like splinters in his ribs. When he stepped back onto the porch, Lenora was waiting, arms crossed tight over her shawl. "Tracks?" she asked. He nodded. "One rider, maybe more waiting. Jeb?" "Could be. Or someone hungry enough to think we're weak." She touched the edge of the shotgun he carried, her thumb tracing the cold barrel. "Then let him find out we're not." They kept the boys busy all day stacking firewood, melting snow to boil water when the pump froze solid. Wyatt taught Caleb how to load the small rifle he'd hidden in the cupboard since the day he brought Lenora home. The boy's hands shook, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Not for play, Caleb," Wyatt said, voice grave. "Only if you got no other choice." Caleb nodded so hard his teeth clacked. "I know, Pa." Inside, Lenora sat at the table with Micah pressed to her side. She stitched another patch on the quilt, hands moving by memory. Every so often she'd hum a tune Wyatt recognized, a lullaby she'd sung when the boys were babies, before the land had tried so hard to take her voice. When the sun dipped, the wind settled, hush falling like a blessing. Wyatt sat by the window, shotgun ready, eyes on the tree line. Lenora stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, her thumb drawing circles that held him steady when the silence threatened to crack him open. "You're not alone," she whispered. He didn't turn, just reached up and caught her hand in his. Never was. Outside, the snow fell thicker. Somewhere past the fence, trouble waited. But so did Wyatt Coulter, rooted deep as the bones under this land, back braced by the only thing that had ever mattered: the family behind him, the promise in front of him, and the fight that still belonged to him and no one else. Dawn came slow and mean, dragging gray light across the fields buried in snow. Wyatt stood on the porch, shotgun slung low against his side, eyes on the tree line that looked calm as a sleeping dog and about as trustworthy. His breath made ghosts in the brittle air. He could feel the cold settling into the wood under his boots, seeping up through the porch boards. Trying to find the cracks in him, behind him, the door creaked and Lenora stepped out, barefoot but wrapped tight. In that old patched quilt, she didn't shiver. She didn't ask him to come inside. She just stood there, close enough that he could feel the warmth she carried, like a lantern against the wind. "You seen him yet?" she asked. "Not yet. You will." Her voice was calm, but there was iron under it. "A man like Jeb don't hide for long." Wyatt grunted, leaning the shotgun against the rail. "Tracks were back this morning, fresh. He's testing how close he can get." She tilted her head, blind eyes searching the tree line he was studying so hard. "He's trying to make you jump first." He didn't answer. He knew it was true. Jeb Rawlins was the kind of snake who rattled just enough to make you draw on shadows, and when you did, that's when he struck. Lenora stepped closer, her fingers brushing the back of his hand where it rested on the rail. "You're not alone in this." Wyatt's eyes stayed locked on the woods, but he curled his fingers around hers, rough skin catching on the soft calluses she'd built sewing, mending, working by touch alone. "I know, just wish he did." She smiled, soft but sharp. "He will." They spent the day bracing for more than the cold. Wyatt and Caleb hauled firewood, stacking it near the stove so Lenora wouldn't have to hunt it out when the wind came. "Up mean again." Micah followed with an armful of kindling, his little boots slipping in the ice every few steps. "Pa, how much longer till the snow melts?" Caleb asked, breath puffing white. Wyatt hefted another log onto the pile. "Soon as it's ready, same as us." The boy frowned, trying to untangle that in his head. "So we just wait?" Wyatt rested a hand on his shoulder. "Waiting ain't the same as giving up, Caleb. It's standing still so nothing can knock you over." Inside, Lenora stoked the stove, turning the last of the lard into biscuits that tasted like hope. She set them on the table, her fingers tapping the wood to guide her hands to each hungry mouth. "Eat slow," she told the boys. "Fill your belly one bite at a time." Wyatt caught her hand under the table, squeezed it just once. She squeezed back. Small comforts in the hush between. Threats. Evening brought quiet that didn't feel peaceful. Wyatt took up his spot at the window, shotgun within reach. Lenora moved around the room like a soft ghost, pressing extra blankets around the boys, checking the latch on the door twice, 3 times. "You keep pacing, you'll wear a hole clean." "Through these boards," Wyatt said, eyes still fixed on the dark. She stopped behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, her voice low enough it felt like a prayer. "Maybe I'll find your fear and patch that too." He reached up, covered her hand with his. "Fear's what keeps us breathing sometimes." She leaned down, her cheek brushing his hair. "But not what keeps us standing." Sometime past midnight, the dog in the yard barked a single sharp note that cut through the hush like a blade. Wyatt's pulse thudded in his throat. He rose slow, careful not to wake the boys where they slept tangled under quilts stitched together. With Scraps and Faith, Lenora stirred on her cot. "Wyatt, stay put," he said. His voice was steady, but his heartbeat wasn't. He stepped onto the porch, the shotgun cold against his palms. The dog stood stiff near the gate, hackles up, tail a trembling line. Beyond the fence, the snow glowed in the thin moonlight, and there they were, 3 shapes on horseback, silent as ghosts but more dangerous by far. Jeb Rawlins tipped his hat, a black silhouette against the night. "Evenin', Coulter." Wyatt's jaw flexed. You picked a bad time to test my patience. Jeb chuckled, low and lazy. Ain't testin' a thing. Just came to remind you what's comin'. You hold out much longer, it'll be the ground. Holdin' you when the thaw comes. Wyatt shifted the shotgun just enough for the threat to settle. You done? Near enough. Jeb leaned on his saddle horn. Word is the bankman's on his way too. Might find himself a fire instead of a farm when he gets here. Ain't that a pity? Wyatt felt the rage crawl up his spine like fire ants, but he kept it tamped down behind his teeth. You lay so much as a match on my fence line, you best not miss the second one. Jeb grinned. You gonna stand here every night till spring? Wyatt squared his shoulders. If that's what it takes. Behind him, Lenora's voice cut the air sharper than any gunshot. He ain't standing alone. Jeb's grin faltered. He turned his head, but in the dim light he could see her small, wrapped in a patchwork quilt, hair loose over her shoulders, blindfold tied neat but defiant. You too, huh? Jeb called. Woman like you oughta know when to run. Lenora's chin lifted. I ran once, I don't run anymore. Silence stretched thin as the ice under their boots. Jeb's men shifted in their saddles, impatient, nervous. Somewhere a horse snorted, breath steaming in the cold. Wyatt raised the shotgun just enough that the message was clear. You best get off my land while you still can. For a second, he thought Jeb would push it draw iron just to see who was faster. But something in Lenora's voice must have dug deeper than Wyatt's threat. Jeb spat into the snow, flicked his reins, and turned. Won't be long, Coulter. Winter don't break for men like you. Wyatt stood there, watching them fade into the line of bare trees until all that was left was the hush of the wind and the soft crunch of the dog's paws circling back to the porch. Lenora moved to his side, her quilt brushing his arm. She slipped her hand into his, cold fingers threading through his warmth. You did good, she murmured. We did, he said. He squeezed her hand tight, the way you hold on to something when the storm tries its best to rip it free. Inside, the boys stirred, half waking to the sound of the wind. Wyatt looked back at that battered house, the patched roof and crooked chimney, the quilt on the bed that carried every piece of their past stitched tight against the cold. He knew Jeb would be back. He knew the bankman would come with his papers. But tonight he still stood. And he knew when the thaw came, there'd be more than snow melting under that wide, hungry sky. There'd be roots, two roots they'd put down together, so deep not even a man like Rawlins could dig them. Out. The wind dropped by morning, leaving behind a hush so heavy it made Wyatt's bones ache. He woke to the scent of strong coffee and the muffled sounds of Lenora humming while she kneaded the last of the flour into a loaf that might stretch 2 more days if they were careful. The boys still slept in a tangle of limbs and patchwork quilts, their breath puffing soft clouds into the cold air leaking through the cracks. Wyatt leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes tracing every small movement she made. Blind didn't mean helpless, he'd learned that early. Lenora's fingers moved like they knew secrets the rest of the world hadn't earned yet. Bread won't rise if you stare at it so hard, she said without turning, just making sure it knows what's at stake. She laughed, low and warm. It knows, same as you do. He stepped in, laid his hands over hers. Nora, last night. Don't you start, she cut him off, pressing a bit of dough into his palm. You held your ground. You didn't. Swing first, that's the man I married. He squeezed the dough, felt it squish between his fingers. He'll be back. And so will we. They ate in silence, tearing chunks of bread, dipping them in watery broth that smelled better than it tasted. Caleb chewed slow, watching Wyatt with eyes too old for a boy his size. Pa, when the snow's gone, can we plant more? Wyatt ruffled the boy's hair. We'll plant till this place remembers what it's worth. Micah piped up, mouth full. What if the bankman comes? Wyatt's hand froze mid-air. Lenora spoke before he could find the words. Then he can walk the fence line and see what's growing here. Not just dirt and seed, us. Micah nodded like he understood. Maybe he did, better than Wyatt gave him credit for. Midday brought the sound of hooves again. Wyatt stepped onto the porch, boots crunching in the icy ruts. A single rider, bundled in a fancy coat too fine for this country, ambled down the path. Bankman, sure as breath. The stranger reined in, looking at Wyatt like he was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Mr. Coulter, is it? Depends who's asking. The man sniffed, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Letter of intent. Your debt's come due. Bank expects settlement by the end of next week. Wyatt crossed his arms. Not news. It should be, the man said, voice clipped. You're behind. You're out of season. And word is you're harboring threats against Mr. Rollins, who, Wyatt's eyes went cold as creek ice. Rollins is the threat. He don't speak for this land. The banker adjusted his collar, fingers twitching. Be that as it may. You've no collateral but these acres. And the bank will not be held responsible for any accidents. Meaning? The man cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated with the paper in his hands. Meaning we'd rather you left quiet. Sell. Cut your losses. Spare the lady and the boys the spectacle. Wyatt's teeth ground together. He stepped off the porch, closing the space between them in 2 slow strides. The banker flinched when the shotgun barrel tapped his boot. I got no quarrel with you, Wyatt said, voice calm as thunder. But you tell whoever writes your pay that if they want this place, they better come ready to bury me in it. The banker's face went pale. He turned his horse so fast the animal nearly slipped on the icy road. Wyatt watched him retreat until the woods swallowed him whole. Inside, Lenora was waiting. She'd heard every word he could tell by the way. She stood, arms crossed, chin lifted like a challenge. Well? She asked. They're done asking polite. Good, she said. I'm done listening polite. They spent the afternoon making ready for whatever came next. Wyatt hauled more wood, hammered new braces on the barn door, checked the old traps by the creek. Caleb followed him, carrying the smaller tools, never more than 3 paces behind. Pa, what happens if they come while we're out here? Wyatt knelt, pulled the boy's cap snug over his ears. Then they meet you first, and they learn we stand together. Caleb's chest puffed up like a banty rooster. They won't get past. My, Wyatt laughed, rough and real. No, they won't. By dusk, the air turned sharper. The dog barked once, twice, then settled. No sign of riders, no sign of Rollins. Just the hush that came before bad things did. They ate in shifts that night. Lenora sat by the hearth, boys curled against her sides. Her voice drifting through the room like a lullaby spun from ragged threads, and stubborn hope. Wyatt took the first watch, boots planted by the window, shotgun resting across his lap. He didn't expect sleep, not tonight, maybe not for a while. But he did expect something else, the shape of Lenora's hand sliding into his when she rose to sit beside him, her warmth pressing into his ribs like a promise he didn't have to carry alone. Outside, the night pressed close, full of threats and whispers. But inside, there was the sound of the fire, the even breathing of 2 boys who still believed the world could be good, and the steady truth of a woman who'd bought his debts long before any banker could try to claim them. Wyatt didn't sleep, not even when dawn came slow and dull over the frozen fields. He sat by the window long after Lenora drifted off beside him, her head tucked into the crook of his shoulder, her breath warm on his neck. The boys lay tangled under their patchwork quilt, little fists curled like seeds waiting for spring. Outside, the snow glittered mean and hard under the pale sun. But the tracks near the fence had grown bolder overnight. He'd seen them hours before boot prints. Not hooves, skirting the edge of the clearing where the fence line dipped. Close enough to listen, maybe close enough to shoot. Wyatt's gut twisted tight. Rollins was done waiting. If the bank couldn't bleed him out, Jeb would do it with fear. One cold night at a time, Lenora stirred as he moved to stoke the fire. "Still here?" she murmured, voice soft with sleep. "Where else would I be?" She sat up, running her fingers over the quilt to find its frayed edge. "You see him?" Wyatt poked at the coals until sparks jumped. "Close enough. Then he's closer to losing." He almost laughed. "How do you figure that?" "Because men like him think they have to push, and men like you know how to stand still." He turned then, just to look at her face, the calm there, the fire she carried that nothing could blow out. "Boys'll wake soon. I'm gonna check the fence." She caught his wrist. "Take the dog, and Caleb, let Rollins see you ain't alone." He nodded, pressing his mouth to her hair. "Always the smart one." She smiled against his chest. "Smart enough to marry a fool who won't bend." They walked the line slow, Wyatt's boots crunching through the drifted snow, Caleb a step behind, shotgun slung small across his narrow shoulders. The dog darted ahead, nose to the ground, tail high and stiff. "Pa, what if they come while we're out here?" Wyatt studied the fresh prints near the fence post. "Then they see you, standing right next to me, and they know better." Caleb's mouth curved into a grin too big for his face. "Ma says I'm braver than any grown man." Wyatt ruffled the boy's hair, pride pinching something tender in his chest. "She's right." He ran his fingers along the rough boards where someone had kicked through the wire. A warning or an invitation. Wyatt didn't bother fixing it, yet no sense patching holes while the wolf still circled the pen dot by midday. The wind picked up, rattling the barn door on its hinges. Lenora stood on the porch, apron flapping against her legs, head turned to where Wyatt and Caleb hammered fresh braces onto the gate. "Jeb Rollins was at Miller's place yesterday," she said when they came in for coffee. Old Walt told. M.E. said he bought up Miller's note for half what it was worth. Wyatt's jaw twitched. "Means he's got cash to grease the right palms." "Means he's scared," Lenora countered. She reached for his hand, traced the line of dirt along his knuckles. "You don't buy allies when you're certain you'll win." Micah piped up from the table where he'd been sorting seeds. "Is Mr. Rollins scared of you, Pa?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. He sat, pulling the boy onto his knee. "I think he's scared of what happens if we don't break." Caleb looked up from the hearth, eyes bright. "Then we won't." Wyatt pulled both boys close, felt the weight of them settle over the gnawing worry in his chest. "That's right, we won't." That night, the wind howled through the rafters, slipping cold fingers under the door. Wyatt sat with his back to the wall, shotgun across his knees. Lenora dozed against his shoulder, her breath a steady drumbeat that kept the dark from pressing too close. He counted the creaks in the floorboards, the hiss of the wind, the quiet rustle of the boys shifting in their sleep. Hours later, when the moon hung low over the fields, he heard it, a scrape of boot on frozen earth, a muffled curse. The dog bristled beside the hearth, lips curling in a soundless growl. Wyatt rose slow, boots silent on the splintered floor. He eased open the door, shotgun steady. There at the far fence line, a figure hunched near the gate, lantern bobbing. Like a will-o'-the-wisp in the dark, "Rollins!" Wyatt's voice cracked the hush like a whip. The figure froze. Then a chuckle drifted back through the cold. "Evenin', Coulter." Wyatt stepped down into the snow, each crunch echoing in. "His bones, you lost?" Rollins straightened, lantern swinging at his side. "Just admiring what's left of your kingdom." Wyatt raised the shotgun. "You come past this line, you find out what's left of yours." Rollins laughed again, but it sounded thin, hollow. "This won't last, Coulter. Snow melts. Men get hungry. Banks come calling." Wyatt platted his boots. "Then they'll find me standing here when they do." For a heartbeat, Rollins looked smaller, somehow less a storm, more a man in a borrowed coat trying to fill boots that didn't fit. He spat into the snow, sneer twisting his mouth. "Ain't over." "No," Wyatt said, voice calm as the dawn creeping up behind him, "but it's closer than you think." Rollins stepped back, lantern flickering like the last word in a story that hadn't finished yet. He disappeared into the trees, and the quiet settled again. Wyatt stood there. Long after, snow soaking into his boots, breath rising in steady clouds. Behind him, he felt Lenora's hand slip into his, her warmth wrapping around his chilled knuckles like a promise. When they turned back to the house, the sky was beginning to pale at the edges, proof that night might come with threats, but morning always came too, whether men like Jeb Rollins wanted it to or not. The next day broke clear, a brittle kind of sunlight that made the snow glare like broken glass. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch with the dog at his side, boots creaking on the boards that had held his weight 1,000 mornings before. He let the cold bite him awake, let it remind him what still needed guarding. Behind him, Lenora's voice drifted through the open door. "It's warmer than it looks," he snorted. "Still cold enough to keep honest folk inside." She stepped out. Beside him anyway, quilt wrapped tight around her shoulders. "Then good thing we're stubborn folk, not honest ones." He glanced sideways at her, the smile catching in his beard. "I'm honest enough for the both of us." She shook her head, but he caught the flicker of a grin. "Go on then. Walk the line, let him know you're watching." Caleb begged to come along, boots too big, hat slipping down over his eyes. He trudged through drifts half his height, but he didn't complain once. At the fence line, Wyatt found the spot where Rollins had stood last night, boot prints frozen deep in the crust. Caleb poked them with a stick. He's got small feet for a mean man. Wyatt barked a laugh, ruffling his son's hair. Boys with big mouths often do. They mended the wire, patched the boards. The dog circled, nose low, every so often lifting his head to scan the tree line like he knew secrets Wyatt could only guess at. "Pa, what if he tries the barn?" Caleb asked. "Then he'll find us ready." "And if he tries Ma?" Wyatt's voice went flint hard. "He won't." Inside, Lenora rolled biscuits thin as hope, stretching the flour so the boys would have something warm in their bellies. Micah sat on a stool, sorting dried beans with careful fingers. "You reckon Pa's scared?" Micah asked. Lenora paused, dough stuck to her hands. "Being scared don't mean you're weak. Means you know what's worth losing." Micah's brow furrowed. "Are you scared?" She set the dough aside, reaching for his small hands. "I'm scared of the day you stop asking questions. Till then, I'm just ready." By sundown, the wind turned mean again, rattling the shutters, whispering things through the chinks in the walls. Wyatt sat by the stove, oiling the shotgun slow and deliberate, each pass of the rag steadying the thrum in his chest. Lenora moved behind him, smoothing her palms over his shoulders. "When's the last time you slept?" He shrugged. "Got enough rest between the cracks." She pressed her mouth to his ear. "Rest while you can. He's desperate now." Wyatt set the shotgun aside, turned to face her. "So am I." She cupped his jaw, thumb tracing the stubble there. "Difference is, you've got something to lose. He's just got something to prove." Night fell like a curtain. The boys curled up by the hearth, the dog pressed close to their feet. Lenora dozed in the rocking chair, her hand trailing the armrest, palm open like she was waiting for something to fill it. Wyatt sat at the window, eyes pinned to the fence line. He didn't need the moon to see what he knew was coming. Hours dragged slow. Then, near midnight, the dog's ears twitched. Wyatt leaned forward, breath caught in his throat. Out by the barn, a flicker lantern light or fire? He grabbed the shotgun, crossed the room in 3 strides. Lenora was already awake, voice a whisper. "Wyatt, stay with the boys." She rose, one hand finding his arm. "Don't you?" He kissed her, quick and rough. "I know." The cold slapped him awake as he stepped outside. Smoke, thin and mean, drifted from the barn's west side. He stalked through the drifts, boots sinking deep. There Rollins, lantern in hand, rags stuffed under the eaves, flame licking at the straw. "Step away." Wyatt's voice cracked. The night like a whip. Rollins turned, grin twisted in the flicker. "Evenin', Coulter. Thought I'd warm your stock up for you." Wyatt lifted the shotgun. "Drop it." Rollins didn't. He tipped the lantern, flame spilling onto the dry hay. The fire caught like breath on dry wood. Wyatt didn't think. He fired once close enough to shred the lantern glass, to pepper Rollins' coat with burning shards. Rollins yelped, stumbled back, cloak half aflame as he clawed at the snow to smother it. Wyatt stomped the spreading flames, boots driving the fire into the dirt. The barn door creaked behind him, Caleb, wide-eyed, dragging a bucket half his weight. "Stay back!" Wyatt barked, but the boy came anyway, flinging water onto the last smoldering patch. Rollins scrambled up, face twisted with rage and something that looked a lot like fear. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're one man. You think this ends here?" Wyatt stepped forward, the barrel of the shotgun inches from Rollins' chest. "No, it ends every damn day I wake up and you don't take what's mine." Rollins' eyes darted to Caleb, then back to Wyatt. "Boy shouldn't have to see this." Wyatt's voice dropped to a growl. "He needs to see it, so he remembers what standing looks like." For a heartbeat, Rollins looked like he might swing reach for the knife Wyatt knew he carried in his boot. But he didn't. He turned, boots crunching through the snow, the darkness swallowing him whole. Wyatt watched until the night was still again, until his pulse settled into the steady drum that said he was still here. Caleb shivered beside him, empty bucket in his hands. "You all right?" Wyatt asked. Caleb nodded. "Pa, did we win?" Wyatt looked at the barn singed but standing, the boy at his side, the house behind him with a woman strong enough to hold every broken piece together. He set his hand on Caleb's shoulder, squeezed until the shivers eased. "We're still here, boy. That's winning enough." And together they turned back, toward the porch light, the warmth waiting on the other side of the door, and the promise that tomorrow they'd stand again. The dawn after the fire came bright and cold, the snow sparkling like it was daring the sun to melt it. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, shotgun propped in the corner now, but within easy reach. The barn still smoked faintly at the edges where the flames had licked at its bones. He stood there a long while, boots braced on the boards he'd built with his own hands, feeling every ache in his body like proof that he was still here. Inside, Lenora moved through the kitchen, voice low as she told the boys to finish there. "Bread slow, make it last." Micah leaned against her hip, eyes big and quiet. Caleb sat at the table, a tiny soldier with soot still smudged behind one ear. Wyatt came in, snow melting on his boots. "Barn's fine. Lost a bit of feed." "Nothin'. We can't patch." Lenora found him in the doorway by sound alone. Her fingers brushed his jaw, checking for burns that weren't there. "He'll come back. I know. And you'll stand again." "I know." She tilted her face up, blind eyes fixed on his. "But next time, you let me stand next to you. This is my fight too." He caught her hand, pressed it to his chest. Always was. The day passed in hard work that felt like defiance. They raked out the scorched hay, spread fresh straw from what they'd saved in the loft. Wyatt climbed up and showed Caleb how to patch the boards where the flames had split them. Micah carried nails in a tin pail, each clink a reminder that they still had enough to hold things together. When they finished, the boys sat on the fence rail, boots kicking against the frost. Wyatt leaned back, eyes squinting at the gray edge of the sky. The wind was soft for once, brushing his hair like a promise. "Pa," Caleb asked, "do you think he's watchin'?" Wyatt didn't have to ask who. "Reckon he's always watchin'. Snakes like him don't have anywhere else to go," Micah frowned. "Why don't he just leave us be?" Wyatt lifted his boy down, boots hitting the frozen dirt. Because some men can't stand to see what they can't break. That night, they sat close around the stove, the boys tucked up tight under the patchwork quilt. Lenora's fingers found Wyatt's where they rested on his knee. "He's waiting for you to lose hope," she said. Wyatt turned his hand over, palm rough against hers. "Man's gonna be waiting a long while." She leaned her head on his shoulder, voice soft, but sharp. "Good, let him wait. Let him learn he's not the only one who knows how to outlast a storm." Near midnight, the wind kicked up again, rattling the roof and sending a shiver through the chimney. Wyatt rose to check the window, gaze sweeping the tree line. Nothing moved but snow drifting off the branches in silver cascades. He felt it, though the coiled hunger of a man like Rollins, out there somewhere, gnawing on the edges of a dream he'd never own. Lenora's voice drifted from the rocker where she rocked Micah back to sleep. "You think he's out there tonight?" "I know he is." She laughed once, low and tired. "Good, let him freeze on the wrong side of the fence." Wyatt crossed the floor and dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his forehead to hers. "You're the meanest blind bride a poor cowboy ever bought. And you're the poorest fool who ever thought he could fight the world alone." He kissed her, quiet and deep, letting her warmth drive out the bite of all the things waiting. Beyond the walls they'd built, when morning came, they found the letter pinned to the gate. Wyatt read it once, then twice, thumb smearing the neat script where Rollins had threatened them with the bank's final word. Lenora stood beside him, one hand on the fence post. "He wants you scared," she said. "Should I be?" She smiled that slow, dangerous smile. Only fools bet on paper over people. Wyatt crumpled the letter and tossed it into the snow. Come spring, this dirt's gonna give him his answer. And until then? He looked at her, hair loose in the wind, boys chasing the dog in circles behind her. "Until then, we stand." And they did. They stood in the thaw and the cold, through the last brittle bite of winter and the first brave shoots of spring. They patched what they could. They buried what they had to. They waited each night with the shotgun in the corner, and each dawn with a pot of coffee that tasted like grit and something sweeter. When Rollins came again, and he did, one last time, desperate enough to think he could steal what he couldn't. Wyatt was waiting. Lenora, too, her hands resting on his shoulders as the shotgun roared thunder that said a man's word was worth the fight. It cost to keep it. They buried Rollins in the dirt he'd wanted to own. No marker but a rock. No words but the hush of wind through the fence line he'd never cross again. By summer, the field stood taller than the boys' heads. Corn and beans, green as fresh hope. Lenora sat on the porch, twins beside her, listening to the wind and the sound of Wyatt's hammer driving new boards into old walls. People came by then, neighbors who'd kept their distance before, tipping hats, bringing seed and stories. They'd talk about the poor cowboy who bought a blind bride and her boys at an auction meant to ruin them. How no one saw it coming when she paid every debt they owed with her faith in the man who never learned how to bend. Wyatt would watch them walk away down the fence line, hand brushing Lenora's shoulder as she turned her blind eyes toward the sun. And when the cold came again, as it always would, he'd stand in the doorway, shotgun waiting but never needed, and watch the frost settle over fields that no man would ever steal again. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.